Section 60 of The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by LesWilLang. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. The End of Aunt Bessie, Part 10. Bessie was married to Mr. Winnery at the registry office in the presence of 3 employees of the ship chandler's firm of Winnery and Company. Mr. Blunden managed to keep his book long enough to be present. He looked very nice in the new clothes Bessie and Mr. Winnery bought him for the occasion, and Bessie, dressed in the finery lavished upon her by an adoring bridegroom, went on her bridal tour to Paris. They stayed at the Grand Hotel, where Bessie had but to open her window at any hour of the day or night to look out upon the crowds and gaiety of the boulevards. They went to music halls and dined each night in a different restaurant, and climbed the Eiffel Tower and visited the races, and were astonished by the chocolate splendor of the opera. Mr. Winnery was happy as a boy, and Paris became for them only a glorified Brighton. It was only when Bessie went back to the house in Bloomsbury that she became aware for the first time in her life of that mental state known as temptation. The house bore the imprint of the late Amanda Winnery, a religious woman and stout believer until her death in the professions of the Plymouth Brethren. The furniture was mostly of black teakwood and red plush embellished by a large amount of inlaid funereal marble. In each room, framed legends set forth such thoughts as "Repent, lest ye fall into the hands of the devil," and "He that looketh upon the wine when it is red is in danger of hellfire." These had been embroidered in appropriately somber colors by Amanda Winnery, and long ago had turned faded and dusty. Bessie found them depressing. During the first few weeks, especially at those moments when the cheerful Mr. Winnery was not in the house, she was filled with a terrible desire to make a visit to the pot and pie. Alone in the depths of that mausoleum, her soul cried out for the companionship of Tina Bits, Alf and Airy, and old Mrs. Crummus. Then slowly, bit by bit, the presence of Amanda Winnery's virtuous ghost began to give way to the presence of the very living Bessie. The framed legends slowly disappeared, whither no one knew, and in their place appeared bright chromas purchased in Mile End Road, and a great deal of brasswork, for which Bessie developed a great taste. And last of all, a gramophone, a parrot, 2 canaries, and a pair of white poodles made their appearance. She loved food and drink with a passion equaled only by that of Mr. Winnery, and so they gave themselves over to a perpetual orgy of eating and drinking. She gracefully allowed her natural indolence to take possession of her, sometimes not troubling to dress until the evening, and each day she grew plumper and plumper, and to the taste of the old-fashioned Mr. Winnery, more desirable. Mr. Winnery beamed with happiness, and for the first time in all his 70 years, life seemed to be what he had always believed that it should be. In his lodgings, Mr. Blunden seemed to be content. She visited him 3 or 4 times weekly, and his spells of drunkenness grew fewer and fewer. He lived quite comfortably on the money allowed him by Bessie, and Mr. Winnery grew to have quite an affection for him, and to share the pride which Bessie found in supporting a cousin of a duke. It might have gone on forever thus, but Mr. Winnery was, when all was said and done, an old man, and drinking and eating was certain to take its toll. One night, while Bessie sat in her wrapper reading John Bull on the opposite side of the fire from Mr. Winnery, she noticed that the newspaper with which he covered his face when he slept was very still, and that his hands hung down in a queer fashion. She went over to him and lifted the newspaper. He was quite dead. He had simply gone to sleep in the midst of his happiness, warm and content after a good dinner, with his Bessie sitting opposite him. End of section 60. Section 61 of The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by LesWilLang. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. The End of Aunt Bessie, Part 11. What might have been called the last phase of Bessie began on the day after the funeral when the will was read. Save for the money to continue the income of the maiden sisters living in Scarborough, the income of the entire fortune was left to Bessie Cullum Winnery. There was no provision made for the nephew who lived in Brno, save the ironical one that on the death of Bessie Cullum Winnery, the entire fortune was to go to him. And Bessie was more than 10 years younger than her nephew and in the most robust of health and spirits. But she was of a forgiving nature, and understanding perhaps the nephew's agitation at the time of her marriage to Mr. Winnery, she arranged that the usual income was to be sent to Brno out of her own money. So now, with Mr. Blunden, she supported 2 gentlemen instead of 1. She dressed herself in the thickest and blackest crape, and then discovered something which she had not noticed before, that for nearly 4 years old, Mr. Winnery had been her entire life, and that without him she was lost. He had taken the place of Bayswater, and the pot and pie, and of Alf and Airy, and Tina Bits, and Mrs. Crummas, and now she had neither one nor the other. As she had grown immensely fat and very indolent, she did nothing about it for a long time. Even the temptation to return to the pot and pie seemed to have weakened, or at least taken another form. She wanted now to return on a single visit, only to show Tina Bits and Winterbottom how well she had done. Her only diversion was an occasional visit to the lodgings of Mr. Blunden. Sometimes he was in and sometimes not, and when she did find him there, he received her with the same dignity and detachment that had marked their long friendship. But, as Bessie said, he was never much of one for small talk, and their conversation lagged. The dialogue consisted usually of inquiries about the book, the character of which remained a perpetual mystery to Bessie, and remarks about the weather. Regeneration of Mr. Blunden seemed well on the way to become an accomplished fact. He no longer got drunk, and in decent clothes appeared the gentleman he was by birth. He was fond of Bessie, but cold, and her own attitude toward him was a little that of a hen that had mothered a duckling. Only once had he ever lost his temper, and that was on the occasion when she suggested that the book must be nearly finished, and that surely it would be in many volumes, at which Mr. Blunden told her that it was a monumental and erudite work, and that she wouldn't understand it even when it was finished. Bessie wept a little, not because her feelings were hurt. She knew he was quite right about her understanding any book, but because the book had not been finished before the death of Mr. Winnery. He would have understood it, she said. He was a wonderful man and understood everything. She was very lonely without him. Life wasn't the same. Perhaps, she suggested tearfully, Mr. Blunden would like sometime to drive out in the Victoria with her and the poodles. But Mr. Blunden told her that he detested riding in Victorias and that the motion made him seasick. His refusal filled her with disappointment, because at the bottom of her proposal lay a crafty plan. She had hoped that one afternoon they would make an early start, and that suddenly they would find themselves as if by accident in Bayswater before the pot and pie. She had pictured to herself the triumph of calling out Tina Bits and Winterbottom, and even old Mrs. Crummas, if she was still alive, to witness the spectacle of herself with horses and coachmen, poodles and Mr. Blunden, the cousin of a duke. She wanted to know what Tina Bits would have to say now about her lack of character, but being of a philosophical turn, she abandoned the triumphal plan and pushed out into another direction in search of human companionship. She simply wanted people to be friendly. She wanted small talk of this and that, spiced perhaps by sallies like those of old Mrs. Crummas. So she turned to her own servants, the cook and the 2 housemaids. But the results were disastrous. After 2 weeks of dreadful uneasiness, all 3 gave notice and sought mistresses who would not seek to be intimate with them. In despair, Bessie told herself that as the widow of Horace J. Winnery, she could not frequent public houses. In any case, she could not go comfortably on foot, and ladies who frequented pubs did not drive up to the door in a victoria with a coachman. It wasn't that she wanted to drink. She could do that at home. She simply wanted an excuse for a talk. At last, she hit upon the idea of going to Brighton, in the hopes that if she did not find it gay, she might at least recapture memories of that lovely visit with Mr. Blunden and Mr. Winnery. So with a great effort, she got off at last, and at Brighton took a gilded sitting room and a bedroom in the showiest hotel in the place. She hired a victoria and went driving with the poodles. She sometimes went down to the beach and sat under a black umbrella while they yapped and barked for stones thrown them by the children. She sat gloomily listening to pomp and circumstance and potpourris from Faust, Carmen, and Cavalleria Rusticana. She sat drearily in dark cinemas. She could not frequent places where you could shoot at ducks and giraffes made of painted tin, nor toss hoops over Japanese vases. She found that hers was a human nature that could not live upon memories. She was trying to enjoy herself, but she couldn't do it. Not alone. You have to have somebody to enjoy things with you. In the end, she began again to hate Brighton, as she had hated it the first time she saw it, only this time it was worse because she couldn't even have the gloomy Mr. Blunden to sit with her in the evenings. End of section 61. Section 62 of The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by LesWilLang. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Louis Bromfield. The End of Aunt Bessie, Part 12. But Brighton appeared to occupy a prominent place in the horoscope of Bessie, and 2 days before she planned to end her visit as a failure, she made by accident the acquaintance of a lady and gentleman sitting at the table next to her in the pavilion. Bessie wouldn't have noticed them, for they were quiet and drab, and she had no taste for drab people. But the lady took a fancy to Esther, the poodle which she had in her lap. The lady asked Esther's name, and so opened the conversation. One thing led to another. The lady and the gentleman were Mr. and Mrs. John Willis, and their speech had that faint Cockney echo which always warmed Bessie's heart. They were from London, they said, and didn't care much for Brighton. It seemed a poor place and much overrated. Bessie said she thought so too. She was from London. Yes, she lived in Bloomsbury. Mrs. Willis, who was a dark, nervous little woman of middle age, said, "Bloomsbury? Well, I never. That's where Mr. Willis and I live." A glow emanated from Bessie's heart and took possession of her whole body. Bloomsbury, well, I never. Queer, and they lived quite near each other and never knew it. Funny how you could live in Bloomsbury for years and never know your nearest neighbor. It was an exclusive community. Mr. Willis, a little blond man with spectacles and a walrus mustache, said that was the way life was, he'd found, and wasn't the music nice. That was the only thing they liked about Brighton, the band concerts. Indeed, they were about to cut short their visit and go back to London, where they felt more at home. They were going to stay 2 more days just to give the place a fair trial. It was Mr. Willis's first real holiday in 15 years. Yes, He was a busy man. He had a linen shop and you could never trust people who worked for you. Queer, said Bessie. She felt the same way about Brighton. She was going the day after tomorrow. Maybe they could go up together. How was she traveling? On the express, first class. Mrs. Willis was afraid they couldn't travel like that. They weren't rich enough. When you've a shop, you have to mind how you spend your money. Perhaps then, suggested Bessie, they would travel with her as her guests. She'd like it. She had plenty of money, and she'd been hoping she'd meet someone to enjoy things with her. It wasn't any good trying to enjoy things alone. It would be a pleasure. But Mr. Willis, who appeared to be cautious, said he'd have to think it over. The band finished playing a potpourri from Cavalleria Rusticana and began putting away its instruments in receptacles of green baize. Mrs. Willis thought perhaps they'd all better be going to bed. So Bessie paid the bill for everything, and they set out slowly, for Bessie found it difficult to move very fast. As they walked, she said she had no children, which was quite true, and so was very fond of the dogs. The Willises must see her other poodle, Minnie. Minnie was at home because her chest was weak, and Bessie didn't think the night air at the seaside was good for her. Queer, said Mrs. Willis. They hadn't any children either, although they'd prayed for them. But she managed to fill in her time in church work. That helped a great deal, and it was sociable. Did Mrs. Winnery go to any particular church? Bessie said no, that she wasn't much of one for church. Indeed, she had never seen the inside of a church. She'd come to Bloomsbury a stranger, and she never yet found her way about. Mrs. Willis said she must come to their chapel. She was sure that she'd feel at home there, and Bessie said they must both come and have Sunday dinner with her. At the end of the pier, Bessie's hired Victoria was waiting, and she drove them home to their shabby lodgings. They parted the best of friends. We might meet tomorrow, suggested Bessie. That would be fine, said Mrs. Willis. About 10:30 at the end of the pier, said Bessie. She waved back to them gaily as she drove off to the splendor of her own suite at the George and Crown. The next day proved a great success, so great a success that they all decided to stay 5 days longer. Bessie it was who paid the expenses. It gave her pleasure, she said, and she had plenty of money. And in the end, they all went back to London on the express, first class, with a compartment to themselves, because Bessie felt uneasy when anyone like Mr. Blunden was put in the same compartment with her. In Bloomsbury, Bessie went to the chapel and Mr. and Mrs. Willis came home in the Victoria to Sunday dinner. She did not care especially for the sermon, nor for the boredom of sitting an hour and a half in a hard pew, but she had found human companionship, and she told herself that she couldn't have everything. Mrs. Willis admired the brass collection and the chromos, and Bessie sent her as a gift a female white poodle. It was the beginning of a great friendship. From then on, Bessie attended the chapel regularly, save on those Sundays when she found the effort to dress quite beyond her power of will. She got used to the services and came to endure them, but she found her real pleasure in the meetings of the ladies and all the auxiliary activities of the chapel. She could sit and drink her fill of amiable talk, and for the chapel she proved a godsend. In a congregation of small linen drapers, greengrocers, and clerks, she appeared to be a female Midas. And because she wanted everybody to be happy, she bought a grand new organ for the chapel and had new windows put in and presented it with a baptismal font. Out of gratitude, the members of the congregation had carved upon it, "Presented to St. John's Chapel by Bessie Cudlip Winnery." As for Bessie, she was happy. She had only one desire, that Tina Bitts might walk in some Sunday and read that inscription on the baptismal font. It was Bessie, too, who established the famous August Bank holiday excursion and annual picnic. Oddly enough, it was Mr. Blunden who suggested to her the idea. He thought it would be splendid if the children of the congregation could get into the country more often, so Bessie made it an annual affair. On the August bank holiday, she hired charabancs, and packing into them all the Sunday school children and as many of the parents as were free, set off into the country for the day. She herself occupied a seat in the back of the first charabanc, leading the way and filled with happiness. After the second year, the excursions became so celebrated. People joined the chapel and sent their children to Sunday school for the sake of the single uproarious outing. In the fourth year after Bessie met Mr. and Mrs. Willis, two momentous things happened. One was the death of the poodles. Esther died of old age, and Minnie of the lung complaint which had troubled her for so long. Bessie bought two new poodles, but they were never the same, she told Mr. Willis, because she had had Esther and Minnie while Mr. Winnery was still alive, and their deaths were like the breaking of a chain that bound her to him. In the midst of her grief, she was sitting one afternoon in the window of the drawing-room, happily dressed and listening to the gramophone, when an antiquated and high-pitched Rolls-Royce drove up and stopped before the door. At the sight of it, Bessie withdrew quickly behind the curtains, but not so quickly that she wasn't able to see that it had on the door a coronet, exactly like the one she had seen on the letter found in Mr. Blunden's room so many years before. A footman rang the bell, and in a moment Briggs came in trembling, pale and shaken, to ask if Mrs. Winnery could receive Herr Gryce, the Duchess of Narkworth. Now, thought Bessie, he's done it. He's gone and told her the whole thing. Peering from behind the curtain, she saw a little old woman dressed very queerly in black, with a black bonnet and parasol, get down from the Rolls-Royce and come up the steps. She ain't so awesome, thought Bessie with relief. She looks just like old Mrs. Grubb that sits in the third pew at chapel. The little old lady came in, and Bessie received her with all the grace of manner Mr. Winnery had taught her. Would Herr Gryce sit down? And did she mind the poodle puppies? No, it appeared, Herr Gryce didn't mind. She kept spaniels herself, cockers, and she was very attached to them. Bessie told her about the death of Esther and Minnie, not without shedding a tear, and explaining their relation to the late Mr. Winnery. And then Herr Gryce came to the point. She, too, had lost her husband a little while before, and since he was dead, there had been a reconciliation of her and Mr. Blunden, the cousin of the late Duke. Indeed, Mr. Blunden had gone to the funeral, and then came to Narkworth House for lunch. And a very changed Mr. Blunden he was from the last time she had seen him. He was even cheerful and happy. And after lunch, he had taken Herr Gryce aside and told her what had happened to him, and how it was a Mr. and Mrs. Winnery who had taken interest in him and helped him when his own family had cast him out. Not that Mrs. Winnery must think the worst of the dear Duke. He was a good man, but hard. The Blundens were all hard, and Mr. Blunden had given him, as the head of the family, a great deal of trouble. So she had come to thank Mrs. Winnery for what she had been doing all these years. If the dear Duke hadn't been in his grave, he would have come too, out of thankfulness for seeing Mr. Blunden such a changed creature. Bessie said that what she'd done was nothing, and that it had given her and Mr. Winnery great pleasure, and that they were very fond of Mr. Blunden, and could not have gone on without him. Herr Gryce said that now it was arranged for Mr. Blunden to live in the Dower House at Narkworth and go on with his writing. He had told her that he was at work on a book which he would have finished shortly and would publish. He had been reticent about it. Did Mrs. Winnery know what it was about? No, Bessie said. It was, she supposed, just a book. But it really was too bad about Mr. Blunden going to live at Narkworth. She'd miss having him there in Bloomsbury. It would be a hole in her life. But Herr Gryce said that Mr. Blunden was going to keep the lodging in Bloomsbury to stop in when he came to town. He had grown fond of the place, She didn't suppose there was anything she could do for Bessie, but she wanted her to know how grateful the family had been for what she had done. Then Bessie suggested that Herr Brize have a drop of tea, and the old lady lifted her veil and said she would be delighted to have some. And after the trembling Briggs had been sent to fetch it, they fell to discussing this and that, and Bessie told her about the chapel and the August Bank holiday excursion and the annual picnic. Herr Brize said she was interested in such ideas. She proved to be a very pious old lady and much interested in work among the poor. She would send Mrs. Winnery a check to help along with her good work, which seemed to be growing at such a pace that Mrs. Winnery would soon find it beyond her means. They drank tea together and became very friendly, and Herr Brize suggested that they might meet again and plan a place at Narkworth where tired girls could be sent for a rest. Mrs. Winnery might help her with the London end of it. Her daughter-in-law, the present Duchess, who was Miss Maisie Folliot of the Gaiety, had already been a great help in recruiting tired girls from the music halls. It was a plan she had had in mind for a long time. She could, she thought, house as many as 12 girls at a time in the old abbey at Narkworth. She was having plumbing laid down. She had begun the day after the dear Duke's funeral. Perhaps Mrs. Winnery would come and have lunch with her one day at Narkworth House, and they would talk it over. But Bessie said she didn't go out much, and maybe Herr Brize would come instead to Bloomsbury. Bessie went with her to the door, and was standing there when Herr Brize drove off bowing and waving pretty as anything from the window of the antique rolls. She was very nice, thought Bessie, and not a bit like a duchess. She reminded her in a way of old Mrs. Crummis, if you forgot the way Mrs. Crummis talked and drank. That evening, Bessie dropped in to see Mrs. Willis and gave her a finely detailed account of Herr Brize's call. The visit roused again the old temptation to return to the pot and pie. She was tormented by the desire to just drop in passing to tell Tina bits about Herr Brize. But she could not go until after the August Bank holiday, which was only 6 days off. There was too much to be done in preparation for the excursion and annual picnic. This year, the crowd would need 14 charabancs. When that was over, she would drive back to Bayswater in splendor for just one afternoon to show Tina and Winterbottom and Mrs. Crummis. End of section 62. Section 63 of The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by LesWilLang. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Louis Bromfield. The End of Aunt Bessie, Part 13. The great day came, and Bessie, sitting high in the back of the first charabanc, watched Mr. Willis twirling his walrus mustache and getting the crowd organized. At last, they were off in an uproar of motors and a cloud of fluttering flags, representing about equally the British Empire and St. John's Chapel. She wished again that Tina Bits and old Mrs. Crummis could see her. They went to Nottingham Forest, and there, under the trees, with the efficient direction of Mr. Willis, they spread out the food from the great hampers. There were all kinds of sandwiches, roast beef and mutton, sausages, tarts and fruit, and quantities of ice-cold beer, a real feast such as appealed to the gargantuan imagination of Bessie. Then Mr. Willis organized a gymkhana in which the children and some of the grown-ups took part, and all this led up in the end to the peak of interest, a race between the fat men of the congregation and the fat ladies of the congregation. There were 23 entries in this event, but when the lineup came, Bessie was not among them. At her absence, a cry went up from all present. She, the fattest woman in the congregation, was entered. She, Mrs. Winnery, who was responsible for all the fun. It wouldn't be any race at all if she didn't take part in it. Among the fat ones, it was already decided to fix the race and allow her to win. The children gathered around her crying, "Go along, Mrs. Winnery," and Bessie protested and laughed until she became hysterical, but in the end she yielded and, removing her hat and jacket, took her place with the others. The race was to be run from the green charabanc to the foot of the great oak that stood on the edge of the road. The whole congregation lined the edge of the course. Among the slim gentlemen, bets were placed as to the winner. Shrieks of merriment scattered the forest stillness, and at last Mr. Willis dropped the napkin that was the starting signal, and they were off. Bessie got off in the midst and was making remarkable speed for so large a woman. Cries of encouragement went up from all sides, for Bessie was the favorite, such a favorite as there had never been in any race. There was not one who did not want her to win, and Bessie was doing her best, although very nearly helpless with laughter. Slowly she forged ahead into the lead. 15 more yards and the victory would be hers. But suddenly something happened. It seemed that she tripped over something, perhaps a root, and fell to the ground. A cry went up and 50 people ran to help her. But when they got to her side, she seemed unable to rise. She lay there quite still, breathing with difficulty. 6 men carried her into the shade of the great oak. They brought water and fanned her, and from somewhere in the congregation there appeared an unsuspected bottle of brandy. They poured part of this between her lips, but there was nothing to be done. Her breathing stopped presently. She had died of apoplexy in the midst of merriment. End of section 63. Section 64 of The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by LesWilLang. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Louis Bromfield. The End of Aunt Bessie, Part 14. At the chapel they gave her a great funeral. Mr. Blunden attended it, and Herr Gryce sent a wreath made by the gardeners at Narkworth House. The preacher delivered a long sermon of eulogy, calling attention to the new organ, the new windows, and the baptismal font, and most of all to the August Bank holiday excursion and the annual picnic. In the end, he said, rather sentimentally, for one reason if not for countless others, she will always be remembered among us. It can be said of her that she shared all she had, and that her only desire was that others be happy like herself. It was Mr. Blunden himself who, as her oldest friend, consulted with Mr. and Mrs. Willis about the tombstone. They decided upon it at last, a simple stone with the inscription, "Here lies Bessie Cullum Winnery, widow of Horace J. Winnery, died August at the age of 46 years at the August Bank holiday excursion and annual picnic of St. John's Chapel. He prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all." The 2 poodles went to join the poodle Bessie had given to Mrs. Willis, and the house was closed and sold, and the following week Mr. Blunden's book was published. It was in 2 large volumes and was named A History of Prostitution, Religious and Secular. It was an excellent and erudite book and received scholarly notices. On the flyleaf appeared the dedication, "To Mr. and Mrs. Horace J. Winnery, whose friendship and aid made the writing of this book possible." But Bessie died without ever returning to Bayswater. She died while the crowd stood in the hot street before the Palazzo Gonfarini in Brno, looking up at the window where Miss Annie Spragg lay dead. End of section 64.
Section 65, The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Louis Bromfield. Sister Annunziata, Part 1. Signora Bardelli, concierge of the Palazzo Gonferini, had asked for Sister Annunziata, and she stood there firmly waiting until she got what she wanted. It was always Sister Annunziata whom they asked for when they wanted a nun to come to the bedside of one of their dying. Sister Maria Maddalena, who stood in the small square room facing the agitated janitress, was in her heart a proud nun, and when she thought they, she meant all the poor who lived in the decaying old rookeries in the quarter about the Palazzo Gonferini. Usually they asked for Sister Annunziata timidly, but there was no timidity in the bearing of the stalwart Signora Bardelli. Sister Maria Maddalena knew her by reputation, a shrewd and a boastful woman who mocked priests and the church. The sister, who was human in her small way, could not resist murmuring, "But you do not hold with the church, Signora Bardelli?" "It is not for me," said the janitress. "It is for the stranger living in my house. She is religious." She gave a shrug, indicating that when she came to die, she would now call upon the hocus-pocus of the church. "Her name?" asked Sister Maria Maddalena. "Signorina Spragg." "Is she a foreigner?" "It seems so. I do not know where she came from. She has lived with me for 16 years. "And you don't know anything about her?" "She never talked. She did not speak much Italian." "She has no money?" "For 3 months she has not paid me anything. She hasn't any more money." Signorina Bardelli began to gesticulate. "What has all this got to do with it? She is sick. She is out of her head. She is dying. I cannot care for her and the whole house as well. I want to see Sister Annunziata." "Sister Annunziata has just come in. She has been staying with the wife of Carducci, the butcher, who died 2 hours ago." "It will not matter to Sister Annunziata. Tell her that Signor Bardelli wants to speak to her." She was stubborn because she was thinking that she could not support the presence in her house of any of the others. They would be asking things of her and disturbing the other tenants. Besides, she distrusted nuns as meddlesome creatures, only Sister Annunziata was different. She told herself she was not seeking aid from the church. She was coming for Sister Annunziata as for a friend. She would not leave until she had seen her. "The old woman may be dying now while we're talking," persisted the janitress, and then, as if to intimidate Sister Maria Maddalena, she added threateningly, "Without absolution, without the last rites of dying, and that will be your fault for delaying me. I will not leave till I talk to Sister Annunziata. It will be on your head." They nearly always talked like this. It was clear that the janitress was beginning to lose her temper. Sister Maria Maddalena said, "Wait," and disappeared through a little door behind the table where she had been sitting, and Signor Bardelli, feeling she had put to rout the entire Church of Rome, seated herself solemnly on a bench against the gray wall beneath the solitary crucifix, a Christ that was elegant and prettified, half clad in purple and crimson garments with a crown of thorns that was gilded. When the door opened again, Sister Maria Maddalena was followed by a tall, malformed figure who was forced to stoop a little to pass through the archway. It was Sister Annunziata. She was rather a grotesque than a woman, and her ugliness made her seem no age at all, although you would have guessed that she was 45. She had high cheekbones and a long, enormous nose, and one eye turned outward a little so that it was impossible to know when she was looking at you. Her great hands hung suspended from fantastically long arms. The nun's dress suited her better than any other. One is not taught to look for beauty as the first quality of a nun. She seemed pale and tired. At sight of her, Signora Bardelli rose politely and greeted her. The manner of open hostility melted away. She told her story, how the strange old woman who had lived with her for 16 years was ill and perhaps dying. Signor Bardelli had found her in her bed unconscious when she failed to appear during the day. She was fond of the old woman. She had grown used to her. Sister Annunziata knew her. It was the old woman who dressed so queerly and ran about the streets of Brno in all weathers. She talked rapidly and with excitement while Sister Annunziata listened. The gaunt nun had a curious air of humility, as if she wanted desperately to please not only Sister Maria Maddalena, but even the janitress. "I will come," she said. "If she is dying, we must fetch a priest. Is she a believer in the true faith?" "I do not know," said the janitress. "She goes often to the church, mostly to see San Giovanni. She is devout and religious." "I will come," repeated Sister Annunziata in her deep masculine voice. She turned and disappeared through the doorway, leaving the janitress to savor her triumph over Sister Maria Maddalena. In a moment she returned with a small bag. Without another word, the two women set out through the dark, narrow streets. As they stepped through the doorway, the wind from Africa blew into their faces like the wind out of an oven. They made haste, for Sister Annunziata had another soul upon her conscience. She walked with the stride of a man, her big feet and long legs covering in one step the distance covered by 2 steps of the stout, short janitress. The streets were empty, and they passed no one all the way to the gloomy archway that was the entrance to the ruined Palazzo Gonferini. End of section 65, read by Brize Cries, Ohio. Section 66, The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Louis Bromfield. Sister Annunziata, Part 2. It was a quarter in which Sister Annunziata knew every door and every window, every cornice. She knew even the holes in the pavement, which had never been repaired in the 29 years she had spent going from house to house where she was needed. She did not, like Sister Maria Maddalena, think in secret pride of these poor sleeping all about her as they. To Sister Annunziata, this was all of the world, its beginning and its end. She had lived in it so long, absorbed by its pain and sorrows, that she had long ago forgotten that she had ever belonged in any other. She had forgotten, too, because this life had been happy and the other had never held any happiness. She quite forgot that she was born Eugenia Beatrice Dorabelli. Among the poor, it was said that she belonged to a proud family, but long ago they, too, had forgotten, if they ever knew, what she had been in the world. She was simply Sister Annunziata, whom they always asked for. Sometimes they called her, behind her back, the ugly one, and sometimes the mad one, but there was in both names a kind of affection of that simple quality which colors the feelings of the humble. In 29 years she had seen none of her family save Faustino, her only brother, and him she had seen only twice when he had come from Ventirolo with family papers for her to sign. She knew that he had married an American woman, and she knew that he had 3 sons, one of whom, the eldest, was an invalid and lived always with his father at Ventirolo. Faustino had troubled himself to write her these things, but from her sisters and from her mother and father, who were long since dead, she had heard nothing. When they put her into a convent at 16, they had forgotten her as if she had never existed. Afterwards, her mother, in speaking of her family, spoke of "my son and 5 daughters," as if Eugenia Beatrice had never existed at all. As a little girl, she had never been allowed to see visitors who came to Ventirolo. She was always kept out of sight with the gardener's wife in the little house by the river. So as a child she had played alone most of the time, because she was years younger than her sisters, and because they were proud and showed her that they did not want her about them. She had come to make friends with the birds and the animals in the park of Venturolo, and to spend her days like a wild thing under the ancient oaks and moss-grown decaying walls. She was 12 years old when she understood what it was that caused them all to treat her differently. She had been sitting quietly one day on a little copse near the ruined pavilion watching a troop of ants build a city, when she heard voices which she recognized as those of her mother and of her aunt. They were devout women who went every day to Mass, and that day, because it was hot, they had stopped on the way home to rest in the pavilion. Her mother was crying because there was no money to marry off her 5 daughters. 2 were already grown and on the way to being old maids. Her husband had only debts and would not give up gambling, and her son of 20 was wild and always in trouble with women. But worst of all, and hardest to bear, was Eugenia Beatrice. Why had God sent her another daughter late in life? And why had he sent her such a little monster who was as ugly as if she had been the daughter of the devil himself? Nobody would ever marry such an ugly creature, even with the dot of 1,000,000 lira. What chance would she have without a penny? Why had she, a good woman, been punished thus? There was nothing to be done with Eugenia Beatrice, said her aunt, but to put her into a convent as soon as possible. Even there, a creature so ugly was certain to frighten the other nuns. That night, Eugenia Beatrice did not return from the park. They searched for her, not too carefully, for there was no one who really wanted to find her. But at evening of the next day, she was brought home by a peasant living on the side of the mountain 15 miles away. He had found her shivering among the rocks when he went out with his goats in the early morning. End of section 66, read by Brize Cries, Ohio. Section 67, The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Louis Bromfield. Sister Annunziata, Part 3. As the 2 women passed through the great arched doorway of the Palazzo Gonferini, the janitress went ahead, leading the way up the wide stone stairway. It was cool here, for the thick walls shut out the hot wind that sang so perversely along the ancient cornices. At the second turning of the stairway, Signor Bardelli opened a door and they found themselves in a long corridor with a row of cell-like doors opening along one side. It was lighted by a single jet of flickering gas. The whole space had once been the great banqueting hall of the palace, but years before it had been filled in thus with partitions and converted into a kind of rookery by the grandfather of Father d'Astier, who now owned the palace. At the end of the corridor, the janitress turned and knocked, and the 2 women stepped into a small square room like a long box turned on end. It was not more than 10 by 12 feet in size, but it was high, so high that in the dim glow of the night light floating in a bowl of cheap blue pottery, the ceilings would have been lost in shadow save for the occasional glint struck by the light against the ancient gilding of the painted beams. As they entered, there arose a flutter and commotion from a great number of tiny birds, which rose from the end of the bed where they had been perching, and circled blindly about until one by one they settled on the rows of cages hung against the gray wall. In one corner there was a narrow iron bed, and on it lay the dying woman, a coarse poor sheet drawn up to her chin. She was quite still and lay on her back with her eyes closed. It was a curious face, neither old nor young, not beautiful and yet fascinating by the perfection of its modeling. It was the first time anyone save Signora Bardelli had ever seen the face without the hat and the thick veil. Great masses of red hair lay on the pillow. In front it was cut short in a long fringe that hid completely the forehead. For a moment Sister Annunziata stood by the side of the narrow bed looking down at Miss Annie Spragg, and then slowly, almost as if she was unconscious of the gesture, One of the gaunt, ugly hands touched the beautiful hair with a curious gesture of reverence. "She is not an old woman," said Sister Annunziata. "She was like that when she came to me," said the janitress. "She cannot be young. She has been here for 15 years. She has not changed much." Then Sister Annunziata touched the brow, gently pushing back a little of the thick fringe of hair. Then she listened to the breathing, and while Signora Bardelli held the nightlight, she bent over to look at the pale, tired eyelids. "She is dying," said Sister Annunziata. "You had better go for Father Baldassare. I will stay with her." She knew all the signs. For 25 years she had sat at the side of the dying. So the janitress went away again out into the hot night, and Sister Annunziata closed the great shutters against the heat of the African wind. When she had done this, she set about putting the room in order, lifting the bedraggled tweed suit and the battered old picture hat and veil from the only chair in the room. Then she sat by the side of the bed and, reaching beneath the sheet, felt the wrist of Miss Annie Spragg and knelt beside the bed to pray. It was not to God that she prayed, or to the Virgin, but to St. Francis of the Birds. He was her saint. He was more than that. He was to Sister Annunziata the only God who had ever existed. She prayed for a long time, commending to his care the soul of the dying woman. The souls of all the dying she commended to the care of St. Francis. He was her saint, whom she adored since she was a little girl. At last she arose, and opening the little bag she brought with her, took out a powder which she dissolved in water and swallowed. Sister Annunziata was ill herself. Lately she had reached the age when her body was sometimes racked with pain, and her mind seemed vague and confused and clouded. Twice lately she had had visions in which she saw St. Francis far off in the midst of a bright field filled with little daisies and primroses. He appeared to be beckoning to her, but he came no nearer. He was the simple St. Francis of Giotto's picture that hung in her room years ago at Venturolo. Lately she prayed at times to him for some miraculous sign of his approbation. She prayed that St. Francis would show her a sign of his love. After bending once more over the sick woman, she seated herself by the bed and took out of her bag a little worn, leather-bound copy of The Little Flowers of St. Francis and began to read. Once she had known it by heart, but lately with her trouble she seemed unable to remember the verses in their proper order. She was forced to hold the book close to her face in the dim light because her eyes were weak and swollen. As she sat reading, the little birds, who had been watching her with bright eyes from the tops of the cages, appeared to lose their fear and flew down in small confused groups of 2 and 3 to perch once more on the foot of the iron bed. End of section 67, read by Brize Cries, Ohio. Section 68, The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Louis Bromfield. Sister Annunziata, Part 4. On the day that Eugenia Beatrice was 16, her aunt took her dressed all in black to enter the convent. They kissed each other goodbye coldly, since the aunt had no affection for her, and the child had long ago ceased to look for any affection from the world. The door closed, and the great ugly girl found herself among the sisters, shrinking and frightened as she had always been in the presence of strangers. They stared at her as intently as if they believed there could be no creature so ugly in all the world. From that day on, her life was given over to pleasing others and the vague, half-formed hope that out of her service there would grow some reward of commendation or affection. She scrubbed the floors and swept the vast hallway, and took upon herself the meanest tasks, and sometimes there would be a reward. a word of praise from one of the nuns, or even the Mother Superior herself. She knelt for long hours on the cold stone floor, praying to St. Francis, who had love for all living things, and so might love her as well, even if God had made her so ugly that she frightened people. For in the great awkward body there was a soul so hungry for love that it would have given itself over to torture and slavery for the sake of anyone who had for her a kind word. But her ugliness was so great that the other sisters, almost without knowing it, thought of her as something grotesque and strange and different from themselves. For 3 years she lived thus, and at last, when she went out into the city to care for the sick and the poor, she began for the first time to find her place in the world and to forget her childhood. Among the wretched she went about with that same humble manner of supplication, seeking to please them in return for kindliness. She entered their squalid houses as a creature unworthy of serving them. She sat at the bedside of old men dying of loathsome diseases, and of young mothers who died bearing their first children. She sat by young and handsome men cut off in the midst of life, and risked her life by the side of children ill with smallpox and scarlet fever. She ate what the poor ate, and slept as they slept, asking nothing of them in return but a word of kindness. And even the young men, who loved only youth and the joy of being alive and the feeling of the hot blood in their veins, came in the end to find a strange kind of beauty in the presence of Sister Annunziata. It was an unearthly beauty that seemed less concerned with the ugly body and face of Sister Annunziata than with all that surrounded her. With her by their side, even the young found death quiet and peaceful. They loved the gentleness of the huge misshapen hands. A kind of light seemed to flow from the ugly face. And she knew sometimes that they called her the ugly one and the mad one, and she smiled to herself and was glad because they would not have called her such names if there had not been affection in their hearts. In a way, her body came to exist no longer, save as an instrument to serve her spirit. She came, unlike other women, to cherish it not as an instrument of love or of beauty, but as something that was useful to her. When at 45 it began to fail her, she prayed desperately to St. Francis to give her strength. It was not death that she feared, but the thought that her body's failing her might shut her off from all those who called her the ugly one and the mad one. St. Francis could help her, whom she loved with all her soul. Sitting by the bed of Miss Annie Spragg, she read, holding the page close to her weak, swollen eyes. When St. Francis drew nigh into Bavagna, he came unto a spot wherein a great multitude of birds of divers species were gathered together. When the holy man of God perceived them, he ran with all speed unto the place and greeted them as if they had shared in human understanding. They on their part all awaited him and turned toward him, those that were perched on the bushes, bending their heads as he drew nigh them, and looking on him in unwonted wise, while he came right among them, and diligently exhorted them all to hear the word of God, saying, My brothers the birds, much ought ye to praise your Creator, who hath clothed you with feathers, and given you wings to fly, and hath made over unto you the pure air, and careth for you without your taking thought for yourselves. While he was speaking these and other like words, the little birds, behaving themselves in wondrous wise, began to stretch their necks, to open their beaks, and to look intently upon him. He, with wondrous fervor of spirit, passed in and out among them, touching them with his habit, nor did one of them move from the spot until he had made the sign of the cross over them, and given them leave. Then, with the blessing of the man of God, they all flew away together. All these things were witnessed by his companions, who stood awaiting him by the way. Returning unto them, the simple and holy man began to blame himself for neglect, in that he not afore then preached unto the birds. The little birds were quite still now, and sat in a row on the end of the bed, some with eyes closed, some watching Sister Annunziata with their bright eyes. End of section 68. read by Brize, Ohio. Section 69, The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Sister Annunziata, Part 5. It was nearly dawn when she was aroused by the sound of creaking boots in the corridor. It was Father Baldassare. She knew the sound of his boots. He was a humble, simple priest who had come many times to the homes of the poor in response to her summons. His boots always creaked. The door opened and he came in, fat and short with a red pimply face, followed by Signor Bardelli. They were both hot and panting from the long walk through the hot wind and the climb up the great stone stairway. As they entered the room, the birds fluttered up again to their cages, and the woman on the bed opened her eyes a little way, slowly and with the greatest effort. For a moment they were darkened by a strange look of terror in them, as if she thought herself already dead, and was awakening in a dark world of black-robed nuns and priests. And then she appeared to recognize Sister Annunziata, and the look of fear faded away. She could not speak. Her lips were frozen. Sister Annunziata made a gesture dismissing the janitress, and then turned to the fat little priest. "We had better make haste," she murmured. "I will stay and hold her up. She cannot raise her own body." And so they made ready to offer Miss Annie Spragg the last service they could give her on this earth, and when Father Baldassare, after much panting and sweating, was ready, Sister Annunziata knelt beside the bed and lifted the dying woman, resting the thin, helpless body against her own gaunt shoulder. They found then that her hands were covered by white cotton gloves, and when Father Baldassare tried to remove them, a kind of convulsion shook her, and into her eyes there came a look so terrible that Sister Annunziata understood her plea, and they left her hands covered. The fat little priest began to read the lines and administer the sacrament, and once more the little birds, no longer fearful, fluttered down one by one to the iron rail at the foot of the bed and sat in a row. The look of fear left the eyes of the dying woman, and slowly the eyelids drooped with weariness. When at last Father Baldassare had finished, the eyes opened a little way, and again a look of pleading came into them. Then slowly, in a kind of agony, Annie Spragg lifted her right arm a little way and made a faint vague gesture, which only Sister Annunziata understood. Still supporting the dying woman, the nun leaned down and took from the chair the copy of The Little Flowers of St. Francis, and from her bag she took the stub of a worn blue pencil. She put the pencil in Annie Spragg's hand, and opening the book, held it for her to write. Slowly and with pain the dying woman scrawled 7 words, and when she had finished the pencil dropped from her hands, and the eyelids drooped again. There was a faint sigh filled with weariness, and Sister Annunziata commended her soul to the care of St. Francis of the Birds. They lay her back upon the bed, and Sister Annunziata opened the page where she had written. At first she could make nothing of the scrawl, and peered at it for a long time with her swollen red eyes. Then slowly she understood it. The old woman had written, "Open the window, let them be free." When Father Baldassare loosened the heavy shutters, the first faint color of dawn had begun to rise behind the mountains, and the rosy gray light was filtering down among the ancient ghost-filled houses that surrounded the Palazzo Gonfarini. As he stood there for a moment looking out into the hot, empty street, there was a faint rushing sound all about him. It was the little birds flying past him, chirping and twittering into the rising dawn. The air was filled with the sound of wings. After Father Baldassare had gone again, Sister Annunziata drew the sheet over the face of the dead woman, and closing the door gently behind her, went down the long corridor and the great stone stairway to seek a bowl of hot coffee. She needed it in order to keep her weary eyes open any longer, and she could not ask Signora Bardelli to fetch it, for Signora Bardelli was a busy woman and had been up most of the night. The hallway and the cortile were gray-blue with morning light, and already out of the cell-like doors there had begun to appear figures which Sister Annunziata knew well. The old man who washed the streets, the blind old woman who sold flowers in the arcades of the Piazza Vittorio Emanuele, Galeazzo, the lame stonecutter. They greeted her knowing that her presence in the Palazzo Gonfarini meant that there was suffering and death within its walls. She understood what it was they wanted to know. It was a stranger, she told them, who lived at the far end of the corridor. They crossed themselves and wished good health to Sister Annunziata and peace to the soul of the dead woman. In a little while she returned, bringing with her candles and a great kettle of hot water, and when she had entered the room again, she set about placing it in order. She went through the drawers of the cheap pine table and the pockets of the gray tweed suit, but she found nothing. There were no papers, not even a lira in money. The dead woman appeared to have no possessions but the clothes she wore and the little birds. Then Sister Annunziata went to the iron bed and lifted the sheet, and for a long time she stood looking down at Miss Annie Spragg. The lines of pain had gone out of the dead face, leaving it transparent and smooth and peaceful against the masses of splendid tangled hair. Again Sister Annunziata, who had a way of talking to herself, murmured, "But she is not an old woman." And once more the great bony hand reached out with a gesture of reverence and envy to touch the beauty of the dead woman's hair. As she set about her task with dim, nearsighted eyes, she saw that the body of the dead woman was not old, and that it was beautifully made, and that in youth it had been superb. She saw that it was a body which perhaps had known the love which was shut out forever from the life of a nun. She had seen bodies many times that were young and splendid, even in death, when it was no longer wrong to look upon their nakedness, and each time it gave her a kind of twisting, sickening pain, so that in the end she had come to look away from them. As she worked with averted eyes, she tried to repeat the psalms she had learned as a child at Venturolo, but in her trouble and in the pain that racked her body and the clouds that obscured her thoughts, she could not remember them. When she had nearly finished her task, she discovered that she had not removed the white cotton gloves that covered the hands. She removed first one and then the other, and then quite suddenly she made the discovery. On the palm of each hand there was a red scar, as if both hands had been pierced by nails. For a moment she stared in silence, leaning close in order to see, and then gently, with a gesture almost of terror, she pushed back the fringe of hair that covered the brow of the dead woman, and there on the brow she discovered other scars, as if a crown of thorns had been pressed upon her head. There was a great livid scar in the side, and the 2 feet had the marks of nails. For a second, a vicious pain racked her body, and a blinding light dazzled her poor weak eyes, and then without a sound she slipped to the floor unconscious, for she had seen the stigmata. It was the sign of St. Francis of the birds. When Signora Bardelli climbed the stone stairs an hour later, she found that all the birds had flown from the room, and that Sister Annunziata lay unconscious on the floor. And on the bed lay the naked body of the dead woman, bearing in its flesh the scars of the crucifixion. The room was quite light now, and the brilliant morning sun streamed in at the open window. For the only time in her life, Signora Bardelli was frightened. She felt a sudden wild impulse to fall upon her knees and pray to the very saints she had mocked. She had a strange fear of being watched by something she could neither see nor understand. She seemed unable to revive the unconscious nun, and when Father Baldassare returned, creaking and sweating along the corridor, he found her still kneeling beside the prostrate figure. He too saw the miraculous scars on the body of the dead woman, and knelt humbly in prayer by the side of the bed. When at last Sister Annunziata opened her eyes, she seemed for a long time unable to speak. They gave her sour wine to drink, and at last she told them a strange and muddled story. She said that as she stood over the body, a great and blinding light had appeared on the wall opposite the bed, and that in the midst of it stood St. Francis in a tiny field of buttercups and primroses, surrounded by all the little birds that a little time before had fluttered about the room. From his body there streamed great rays of light. These appeared to come from his hands and his feet, his side and his brow, where there were wounds like those of our Lord. The light streamed toward the body of the dead woman. After that she could remember no more. As she told the story, a strange unearthly look of happy madness came into her face, so that even the hard Signora Bardelli felt a sudden awe. Before noon the story of the miracle had traveled through all the quarter, and crowds came streaming into the cortile, up the staircase and along the corridor. Pushing and crying out hysterically, women thrust themselves into the chamber of the dead woman, and there tore her clothes and the very chair and table into bits as relics. They bore off the cages of the little birds and the nightlight, and one woman soaked her shawl in the water that was in the bowl of cheap blue crockery. In their hunger for relics, they snatched the bedraggled roses from the old picture hat and ripped bits from the very sheet that covered the body of Miss Spragg, until only torn fragments remained to hide its nakedness. It was the police who at last cleared them from the house, pushing them rudely back into the street. But the crowd would not go away. It hung about the great arched gateway of the Plaza Gonferini, and women knelt in the dust to pray beneath the windows. Through all the confusion and the vulgar turmoil, Sister Annunziata went about calmly, with that strange new light of happiness in her face. She was loved at last. St. Francis had sent her the sign. End of section 69, read by Brize Cries, Ohio.
Section 70, Coda, Part 1. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 70, Coda, Part 1. On the morning following Mr. Winnery's extraordinary attack of romanticism, he awakened slowly and lay abed for a long time after the goitered Maria, maid servant of 20 years, had come in and flung open the shutters. He awakened conscious that he was feeling exceedingly well and freed of the usual torpor caused by the combination of a bad liver and the wretched climate of Brno. He was aware that the wind from Africa had died out altogether, and that in its place there was a cool, fresh breeze that changed the brilliant sun and blue sky from a nightmare into a delight. It was odd, he thought, how well he felt, considering that he had been up walking the streets on the night before until after midnight. It occurred to him that perhaps you could break habits without inviting calamities. Perhaps breaking habits made life more exciting. It was a thing he had never tried before, this exciting way of living. And then his eye fell upon the telegram, and he suddenly felt even happier. He remembered that now he could leave Brno forever. He would not have to be buried in the Protestant cemetery among all the people who had bored him for 20 years. He would not have to rest through all eternity beside someone like old Mrs. Whitehead. He could now travel everywhere and anywhere, always seeking with the bright hope of an incurable romantic, some spot that would be as paradisical as it was reported to be by poets and old ladies and tourist circulars. Aunt Bessie was dead. God bless her. He rose, and before doing the exercises which kept his waist measure within moderation and his liver in action, he went to the window and looked out. Below him in the little square the usual things were going on. There were bony horses and cab drivers in varnished leather hats, 3 English ladies in tweeds and picture hats, armed with umbrellas, Baedekers and cameras, an elderly American couple reading out of a book about the tower of the church opposite. They read a paragraph and then regarded the tower again, as if uncertain which things had been regarded by Mr. Ruskin as beautiful and which things had not. A brown-robed monk came down from the high monastery of Monte Salvatore. A herd of goats, with the shepherd in a black smock, playing a tune on a strange pipe held in the hollow of his hand. A Ford automobile with 9 Italians. Though it was early morning, they were dressed in full evening clothes, clearly bound for a wedding or a christening. A woman leaned out of a window and screamed at the goat herd. He halted the flock, put away the pipe, and set himself industriously to milking one of the she-goats. It was a delightful place, after all, Brino. Perhaps it wasn't as bad as he had thought. Now that he was rich, he could keep a larger apartment and have a villa somewhere in the hills. Suddenly it occurred to him that it must be later than he thought, and regarding the tower opposite, he discovered that it was already 10 o'clock. It couldn't be as late as that. The clock was Italian, and therefore probably an hour or 2 wrong. It was never correct with the sun, and to Italians such things didn't matter. But his own watch showed him that the clock was not fast, which he knew would be unusual in Brino, but slow by half an hour. It was 10:30. Maria had not called him, and for the first time in 20 years he had overslept. For a moment he experienced a wild desire to summon Maria and abuse her, but something about the square, the sky, and the sight of the wedding party in the Ford made him soften. He decided to do nothing about Maria's dereliction. It was odd indeed how well he felt, and how young and spry. Then he saw coming round the tower of the church the tall, awkward figure of a nun, walking in great haste, her full black skirt swinging with her masculine stride. It is the crazy one, he thought, Sister Annunziata. As she crossed the little square toward his house, he saw that she was smiling and talking to herself in the most animated fashion as she walked. She turned and disappeared through the archway by the old palace of the Podestas. The sight of her brought to mind Miss Annie Spragg. Well, it was an interesting case, and he would have to go further into it. If he continued in his present health and spirits, he would be able to complete miracles and other natural phenomena within a year or 2. He must see Mrs. Weatherby again and go further into the history of Miss Spragg, at a time when they would not be interrupted by the presence of such frivolous and worldly people as Father Dastier and the Dorabelli woman. At that moment he saw the black and red motor swing from under the archway and cross the square. In it were the Princess Dorabelli and a man whom he did not know, a dark, handsome man who was not Father Dastier. Ah, thought Mr. Winnery, with a sudden warm feeling of being a worldly devil, that is why she is in Brino at this time of year. That is it. A lover, a rendezvous. It made him feel almost a gay dog. It made him also think. If she is not too old for love, neither am I. A man lasts much longer than a woman, and that in turn made him think of Miss Fosdick, and reflect again that now he was rich, he could do anything he pleased. With money you could buy anything. Perhaps he might rescue Miss Fosdick from the dragon's den and marry her. Now that he was rich, he would have to upset a good many habits, and upsetting habits, it seemed, did not bring disaster. On the contrary, he never felt better. Dear me, it was an odd world. He decided that he would hire the fiacre once more and drive out to the Villa Leonardo before making up his mind entirely about Miss Fosdick. It was a pleasant day, and the drive would be refreshing. He could wring more information from Mrs. Weatherby if he could prevent her long enough from talking about herself, and perhaps he could have a word alone with Miss Fosdick. He might ask permission to call upon her. Yes, he would need a wife now that he was rich, but he must be cautious. At 53, one had no time to indulge in mistakes. He tried to pretend to himself that he was being merely practical and not at all sentimental, but at the same time he experienced again that pleasant tickling sensation of satisfaction over his interest in her. It was no more than the shadow of desire. It flattered him that there was a certain, grossness in the feeling. He had a most stimulating awareness of adventure. The door opened and fat Maria came in, looking, decided Mr. Winnery, as if she had swallowed a canary. That, thought Winnery, is because she has been guilty of a dereliction of duty and expects a scolding. "Buongiorno," he said brightly. "Buongiorno." Maria looked somewhat astonished. Feeling a little encouraged to gossip, she asked if Signor Winnery had heard the latest about Signorina Spragg. Miss Annie Spragg was being buried today, and the burial was causing the local church authorities a great deal of trouble and uncertainty. The question was a purely technical one. No one could decide whether the miraculous scars should be officially recognized as a miracle and the body of Miss Annie Spragg considered as that of a potential saint, or whether she ought to be treated simply with the conventional respect due a devout follower of the church. There was even a party among the more bigoted older priests which held that there was not any proof that she was a Roman Catholic, and that it was not proper to defile consecrated ground with the body of a heretic. And there was always that ancient decree of Pope Sixtus IV issued against St. Catherine of Siena. Sixtus IV holding that the miracle of the stigmata was the exclusive monopoly of St. Francis, and that it was a censurable offence to report it of anyone else. The whole thing threatened to grow into a scandal. Miss Annie Spragg had no money, so Sister Annunziata was paying for the funeral. Did Mr. Winnery know who Sister Annunziata really was? Well, it turned out that she was born the Princess Dorabelli, and she was put into a convent because her family saw no chance of ever marrying off so ugly a woman. Maria paused for breath and then went on. Had Signor Winnery heard about Father Baldassare, that little fat priest attached to San Giovanni? Yes, the one who had witnessed the miracle and found Sister Annunziata lying senseless after she had been visited by St. Francis. Well, Father Baldassare had left the church and was going from town to town on foot to preach in the marketplaces. He was going to purify Christianity, she said, and begin all over again. That was a silly idea. How could there be any Christianity without the church? Wasn't the church Christianity? He has always been a little cracked, she said, and now he seems gone out of his mind. She had heard all this at the market. Ah, thought Winnery, who had quite forgotten that he was still clad only in an Italian nightshirt embroidered in red cotton. No wonder she was late. Maria walked to the window on the opposite side of the room and stood looking down into the market. "Look," she said, pointing down. "There he is now." Winnery crossed over to the window. In one corner of the market by the fountain of dolphins and serpents, There was a crowd of cooks and chambermaids and cab drivers. On the edge stood the 3 English ladies with the Baedekers, umbrellas and cameras. One had placed her hand behind her ear in order to hear more distinctly. They surrounded a fat, short figure clad in a brightly checked suit of the kind affected in London by bookmakers. In one hand the figure held an umbrella. The other hand was being used in emphatic but ineffective gestures. The crowd stood staring up at him, amused and astonished, but aware that it was being treated to an entertainment which cost nothing. The speaker's voice was weak and shrill, so that it did not carry above the tumult of excited bargaining that was in progress on all sides. After a time the cooks began to drift away one by one to buy their leeks and spinach and potatoes. It was Father Baldassare, turned to plain Fulco Baldassare, leader of the new Reformation. Winnery, watching the spectacle, had a swift, fleeting vision of humanity struggling to extricate itself from some colossal muddle. Then he returned to his breakfast, which he ate with a hearty appetite. End of section 70. Coda, Part 1. Section 71. Coda, Part 2. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 71. Coda, Part 2. From the moment of Miss Fosdick's hysterical flight into the great world, life began to annoy Mrs. Weatherby. For 20 years she had managed to subdue its annoyances because dear Gertrude had seen to every tiresome detail: the packing, ordering the food, shipping trunks, buying tickets, giving orders timidly to servants. In short, doing all the things which might have broken in upon the spiritual quiet of the great religious experimenter. It had become a system so thorough and so monotonous that Mrs. Weatherby had quite forgotten the grey existence of such troublesome details. Now that her slave was gone, her life collapsed about her ears in a confusion of petty annoyances. Margarita wanted to know what Giovanni should bring from the market. The men who were building a cesspool found that the cement was of the wrong kind. Should Giovanni buy a new tire for the Ford? Lulu, the elder Pomeranian, spit up her breakfast. There was no more sunflower seed for Anubis. It was as if Mrs. Weatherby's star had slipped into some profoundly disastrous conjunction. She remembered with terror that her horoscope foretold disaster and disappointments during the 6 months beginning with August, and she was forced to face and solve all these calamities while suffering the greatest anguish of mind. Had she not been betrayed by the one creature on whom for 20 years she had lavished the wealth of affection and kindness of a mother? For 20 years she had been harbouring an ingrate, nay, a viper, at her bosom. She kept saying this over and over again to herself, while she squabbled with Margarita and dosed Lulu with castor oil. And all those cruel things which Gertrude had said the night before, she must have been thinking them in secret for years, while she lived on the bounty of her doting Aunt Henrietta. And to go away without a word, not even telling her Aunt Henrietta she had gone. But she will return, she kept telling herself. She will return in good time, perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow. What is there for her to do but to return? And when she returned, she would be more controllable than before. After her ingratitude and treachery, she would seek to do penance. Perhaps it would be better in the end. If there was a divine law, people suffered for such behaviour. I must not think evil thoughts, she told herself, because evil thoughts make us old and tired and bring on the twilight. No, she would be sweet and forgiving when Gertrude returned. Sweet and forgiving, she repeated to herself, but firm as well. She must not give in too easily. Suddenly it occurred to her that her misfortune might have to do with the strange statue found in the cesspool. From the very beginning she had disliked it as an obscene and disturbing thing, and now Miss Fosdick was gone, and there was no other object at hand on which to vent her ill temper. She began to hate the statue. There was no doubt that such an image aroused the lower nature. It was perhaps a sight of it that had caused Gertrude to behave in so idiotic a fashion with the Duke of Fontarabia. Perhaps it was the statue that had driven her to run off like a madwoman. She might, she thought, give the statue to a museum. Or what was better still, she might bury it again, even deeper than it had been before. Yes, that was it. She would have the workmen bury it once more, and then Gertrude would return, and Lulu would recover, and all these troubles would disappear. Perhaps it was silly to think such things, but you could never tell about superstitions. Sometimes they were quite right. She would not have the thing about, leaning against the ilex, watching everything that passed in the garden. Presently she began to worry again about the Annie Spragg affair. Isolated there on the side of the mountain, she could not discover what was happening, nor, what would have been the most valuable of all knowledge, the attitude the church was taking toward the miracle. She was aware that she must discover this before she spoke again to Father Dastier. If the church looked upon Annie Spragg as an impostor, then she must wash her hands of Annie Spragg and support the church by telling all the dark things she knew about Annie Spragg. If the church chose to regard the affair in the light of a miracle, then she must espouse the cause of Miss Annie Spragg and appear as her friend. It was all perplexing enough without having the ungrateful Gertrude disappear just when she was most needed. At noon she ate nothing but retired to her room for a siesta. In her agitation she had not closed an eye all night. More than that, Gertrude had not been there to will away the currents of evil directed against her by her enemies. Lying awake and alone in the house, she had kept hearing ominous noises in the garden and in the rooms below. It was 4 o'clock when she awakened at last, and went down into the garden to attend to the business of reburying the hateful statue. When she saw it again, the halo of evil surrounding it struck her even more forcibly. It was only after the reflection of the wakeful night that she realized its full significance. Why, she saw now that portions of the statue had been stained, perhaps 19 centuries earlier, in an obscene fashion. In bad Italian, and with the aid of much pantomime, she finally conveyed to the workmen her idea. When at last they understood her, they exploded in a wild burst of protest. She was unable to understand any of it, though she understood well enough that they were in a tremendous state of excitement. They all screamed at her at once. In the very midst of the uproar, Pietro, the old goatherd, who lived on the hillside below the villa, suddenly appeared bearing 2 melons and a branch laden with green olives. He was an immensely old man, dirty and unkempt, with a scraggly grey beard and pointed ears that stuck through apertures in the matted long grey hair. He walked with a limp sideways like a crab. At sight of her he removed his battered hat and gave her a series of grovelling bows. At first she thought he had brought the melons and olive branch as a gift for herself, and touched by the picturesqueness of Italian customs, she quickly assumed the gracious manner of a chatelaine and came forward to receive the offering. But Pietro made it certain that they were not for her. As if he thought that she meant to take them from him by force, he cunningly shifted them behind his back and made a flowery speech, of which she understood not a word. Then his true purpose was revealed. He went past her and laid them at the very feet of the horrid statue. At the same moment, one of the workmen, the bronze-chested Giovanni, whose physique had caught the wandering eye of the Princess Dorabelli, said something to him, and he, in his turn, began to gibber at the now completely distracted seeress. It appeared that the arrival of Pietro gave them fresh courage. She saw that they intended to prevent her by force from carrying out her plan of doing away with the obscene thing. She was the tenant of this property. She intended to do with it as she pleased. Her fleshy nostrils began to distend in an ominous way. Italians, so volatile by nature, could not imagine the force of a granddaughter of transcendentalists moved to anger by a long series of torments. And unlike Miss Fosdick, they had never witnessed the full fury of one of her tantrums. But at the crucial moment there appeared from the opposite end of the garden a whole procession of goats, which had faithfully followed Pietro up the stony hill. At the very end of the procession, emerging from the tunnel of greenery, appeared Mr. Winnery, nattily dressed for courting in a checked suit, a new pearl-grey hat, and lemon-yellow gloves. End of section 71. Coda, Part 2. Section 72. Coda, Part 3. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 72. Coda, Part 3. Mr. Winnery, entering into the cool, dark garden, was overcome, as he had been once before, by the certainty that he had lost his mind. He was aware that as the last of a long procession of goats, he had made an undignified entrance, but his resentment at this died almost at once before the spectacle of the great religious experimenter surrounded by gibbering Italians, who seemed bent upon doing her some bodily violence. Fearful that Miss Fosdick had perhaps already been done away with, he hurried forward through the midst of the flock of goats, driving them out of his path with blows of his malacca stick, just purchased on the strength of Aunt Bessie's legacy. At sight of a male foreigner, even so harmless a male foreigner as Mr. Winnery, the workmen grew silent, and Pietro retired into concealment behind them. Mrs. Weatherby, with a new face composed almost instantaneously, floated forward and greeted him, explaining at the same time that she was having difficulties with the workmen. There was perhaps some confusion owing to their inability to understand each other. Perhaps Mr. Winnery would act as interpreter. He addressed the workmen and received in reply a perfect torrent of explanation. They all spoke at once, and into their soft voices they threw whole gamuts of seduction. It would perhaps never have finished, but in the midst of it he turned to Mrs. Weatherby. "They are saying that you must not bury the statue again. It is an ancient god of fertility, and if you bury it, they say the crops will be blighted, and the she-goats barren, and the eggs unfertile. They say you will bring calamity on the neighbourhood. It is an ancient god of fertility, Priapus, offspring of Dionysus and Aphrodite, or if you prefer the Asiatic version of Sabusius and Astarte. They are quite right, though how they know such a thing is beyond me. You will find he would have, like the Italians, gone on for some time, explaining the legend of Priapus, but Mrs. Weatherby interrupted. The nostrils had begun again to distend and quiver. She seemed about to snort fire. "It is my garden," she said quite firmly. "I shall do with it as I like." "Why not," suggested Mr. Winnery tactfully, "give the thing to a museum?" "No, I understand about these things. Haven't I devoted my life to studies of the more psychic religions? It is an evil omen and ought to be buried again, I am certain of it. Ever since it was found, I've been having misfortunes." Winnery shrugged his shoulders. He failed to see quite how the seeress could, with intellectual honesty, support her own superstition and reject the much more ancient one supported by Pietro and his party. That, he supposed, was the common attitude of superstitions and religious people. But he simply turned to the workmen. He told them that the Signora wanted the thing buried, and that if they chose not to obey her, she would find other workmen. Deciding that they could risk a blight in the future more easily than the loss of a job in the present, they turned back sullenly, but not silently, and began to dig. Pietro made as if to launch a final protest, and then fell silent. The goats had by now gathered in a circle about the scene of the conflict, watching it with large round eyes. Mr. Winnery had a fleeting impression that Pietro had winked at him, but he could not be certain, and he could not, as a guest of Mrs. Weatherby, endanger her prestige by acknowledging the wink. "Now that we have settled it," said Mrs. Weatherby more calmly, "you must have some tea." As they started toward the villa, Mr. Winnery turned again to regard the statue in disgrace. It was a remarkably fine thing, he thought, and a pity to bury it again. Still, with this eccentric woman, arguments would arrive nowhere. She placed no value upon anything in the world but her own ego. It was a fine thing, the statue. At moments it seemed almost to have a life of its own. Just now, in the heat of the afternoon, it appeared lascivious and amused, as if it were saying, "You may bury me and unbury me 1,000 times, but you can't be rid of me. I shall be with you always." It was a pity, thought Mr. Winnery. It seemed to him that the statue had brought him luck. Everything had happened since Miss Annie Spragg had died, and the statue was dug up from the cesspool. "Shoo!" cried Mrs. Weatherby, making threatening gestures and pushing her way through the goats. End of section 72. Coda, Part 3. Section 73. Coda, Part 4. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 73. Coda, Part 4. They had tea, the same bad tea out of rusty tins that tasted as if it were made of hay, and dried digestive biscuits very nearly as old, thought Mr. Winnery, as the freshly buried statue. Mrs. Weatherby at once struck an attitude in the fake Renaissance chair and began to talk about herself. Anubis the parrot blinked at them and gave out a series of disgruntled croaks. Everything was exactly the same as before, save that one of the Pomeranians, instead of yapping, lay with a pallid expression on a Veronese green pillow trimmed with gold, and the view through the loggia was even more magnificent in the clear transparent air that had followed the dust-laden sirocco. He was aware that there was still no sign of Miss Fosdick, nor any reference to her. He reminded himself that it was Miss Fosdick, after all, whom he had come to see. He did not care to hear any more of the history of Mrs. Weatherby. Once, however, Mrs. Weatherby did turn aside from her principal subject, but only long enough to ask for the latest developments in the scandalous affair of Miss Annie Spragg. He passed on to her what he had heard that morning from Maria. It was information which only left her where she had been before. He had not, he told her when asked, seen Father Dastier, although he had seen the Principessa Dorabelli driving across the square with a stranger, a man to be exact. This bit of simple information he translated with the slight but meaning inflection that had come to be a habit born of long association with the old ladies of Breno. "A very interesting woman," said Mrs. Weatherby. "I have never before seen an aura so red." "Ah, you understand auras," murmured Mr. Winnery in a helpless effort to fill in time, until he gained the courage to ask where Miss Fosdick was hiding. He was not interested in auras except as nonsense. It was absurd that a man of his age should be as shy as a schoolboy. Why could he not utter Miss Fosdick's name? "Yes, it is a profound and interesting subject." "Have you noticed my own?" asked Mr. Winnery wildly. "Oh, yes, I noticed it at once yesterday by its paleness. I had seldom seen so pale an aura, but it has changed today remarkably. It is much redder." "And what does that signify?" Mrs. Weatherby simpered. "I don't know that I ought to tell you, Mr. Winnery. Still, you are an intelligent man, and will not misinterpret my interest in such things." Yes, no, of course not," murmured Mr. Winnery. "Red," said Mrs. Weatherby, "indicates passions of the body. I think," she hesitated for a moment and then plunged, "I think someone, something, some new, shall I say, interest, has entered your life since yesterday." "Oh," said Mr. Winnery, somewhat startled. But he was aware again that he was flattered by the change in his aura. Green is the colour of the passions of the mind. That, of course, is much worse, depraved, one might say. She was peering at him through her glistening pince-nez with a mystical intensity that made him squirm on the hard chair. He saw with terror that she was scrutinizing his aura. "I am glad to see, Mr. Winnery, that there is no trace of green in your aura." Mr. Winnery murmured his gratitude and said modestly he supposed that that was a thing you could not control, and that therefore he ought to take no credit to himself. Secretly he was feeling disturbed for fear that her intensity might increase and throw her into a trance. What could he do with her if she suddenly went into a trance? She did not. "That is what interested me about the statue," she continued. "It has an aura, Mr. Winnery, a positive, unmistakable aura, and it is a vile mixture of red and green. That is why I thought the thing better buried again at once." "And what does that mixture signify?" "That, Mr. Winnery, I cannot bring myself to tell you. Will you have more tea?" But Mr. Winnery had done his duty to the social amenities and did not feel called upon to drink a second cup of hay-water. "But I don't understand, Mrs. Weatherby, how a statue, an inanimate thing, may have an aura. I thought auras were connected, so to speak, with what I suppose you would call the life fluid." He found himself wondering if Miss Fosdick had been forced to undergo much of this sort of thing, and his sympathy for her deepened and broadened. "It is an extraordinary case. Doubtless the aura is an accumulation of evil thought directed toward the statue during its worship some centuries ago." Mr. Winnery thought. I must ask after Miss Fosdick, and yet how dare I, after she has discovered the appearance of red in my aura? Aloud he said, I have never had the pleasure of knowing anyone who saw auras. It must be very disconcerting. I mean always to see not only your friends, but their auras as well. He was beginning to be afraid of the woman. It is a privilege given to few, replied Mrs. Weatherby with a certain smugness. He then asked her about Miss Annie Spragg. He felt, he said, that Mrs. Weatherby had been somewhat constrained yesterday by the presence of Father Dastier and the Principessa Dorabelli. With him, of course, it was different. With him she might feel quite free, as with a man of science. But it was clear that her lips were to remain sealed. She would say nothing. Yet there remained with him the certainty that she knew far more than she chose to tell. At last he rose and made his adieu, filled suddenly with the terrible suspicion that the seeress believed he had come back to the Villa Leonardo because he found her attractive. A certain mincingness had entered her manner. She bridled and held out her little finger as she raised the teacup to her lips. Quite suddenly he was terrified and filled with a sense of panic. What did this extraordinary woman expect from him? For a moment he had the fantastic idea that the stone god, which by now must be safely buried, was having its revenge upon her. She went with him to the door, snapping her pince-nez back on the gold fleur-de-lis pin attached to her ample bosom, and thanking him for the call. She urged him to come frequently. It was a lonely place. They seldom saw many people, but of course it was impossible for her to live where the confusion of 20th century civilization broke in upon her meditations. She would always arrange it so that they could talk without intrusion. As they reached the garden, Winnery saw that the work had been done. The statue was buried again, and atop the grave-like mound of reddish earth, Pietro had left the olive branch and the 2 melons as a propitiatory offering. The goats had disappeared. Wildly he said, I have not seen Miss Fosdick. I was hoping to say good day to her. She is not here, said Mrs. Weatherby. There was a pause, in which Mr. Winnery found himself at a loss for conversation. At last he said, I did not know she was going away. Why should I know? Yes, she has gone on a holiday, the first, I must say, that she has had in 20 years. I urged her to do it. I felt that she had had quite enough of me. Dear Gertrude is always so devoted. She never wants to leave me for a moment. This cast Mr. Winnery down. She must indeed be devoted, he murmured, and then suddenly, Good-bye, Mrs. Weatherby, and thank you for the tea. At the mouth of the tunnel he turned suddenly, seized by what he felt must be the beginning of madness. If Mrs. Weatherby happened to be looking at his aura, she must suddenly see that it had turned a flaming red. When do you think she will return? He asked. I don't know, said Mrs. Weatherby. That was left open. I told her to stay away as long as she liked. I don't imagine she'll be away long. She has been so devoted for 20 years. A thing like that gets to be a habit. Have you ever noticed, Mr. Winnery, that it is our habits and our friends which give permanence and solidity to life? Quite right, Mrs. Weatherby, quite right. By breaking habits he had gotten himself into this muddle, breaking habits by driving in the hot afternoon with the African wind blowing, breaking habits by going to bed long after midnight, breaking the habit of regarding people as literary material rather than human creatures. He had made this long trip for nothing. He had not seen Miss Fosdick. He had not had a word with her. He did not even know where she was, and he did not know when she would return. He had had a wretched tea and ruined his clothes. The checked suit, the new hat and yellow gloves reeked with the strong smell of goat. But Mrs. Weatherby had clearly been attracted by him. That he could not forget. End of section 73. Coda, Part 4. Section 74. Coda, Part 5. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 74. Coda, Part 5. Obstacles and difficulties, says an old sentimental proverb, only serve to increase a passion, and the disappearance of Miss Fosdick only served to inflame Mr. Winnery. If Miss Fosdick had been at the Villa Leonardo, she might have said or done something which would have upset so precise and finicky a man. There might have been a hole in her stocking, or she might have blown her nose too loudly, or been surprised by the sudden call of Mr. Winnery. Her hair might have gone sloppily. Since she was not there, none of these things happened, and Mr. Winnery left disappointed, which is always good for love, and cherishing only the memory of her richly curving bosom, her nice eyes, and her dove-like air. And since, despite himself, he really wanted to believe in the beauty and virtue of Miss Fosdick, and really wanted to have his life disturbed and exciting, now that his liver troubled him less, he went on believing in these things more and more passionately. In the days that followed, Mr. Winnery grew animated and slept very little, walking a great deal and calling upon Mr. Winnop, the curate, and the few old ladies who remained in Breno. He was even seized with a fit of ambition to recover some of that glory he had known a quarter of a century earlier as a literary prodigy, and set to work to bring order from the confusion of notes, copyings, and false starts, which represented the existing state of miracles and other natural phenomena. He discovered that love, for he conceded that love was the proper diagnosis of his strange transformation, and the creative instinct possessed an obscure and subtle interrelation. After much wrangling among the local clergy, Miss Annie Spragg was buried at last in the little cemetery on the far slope of Monte Salvatore. The various parties reached a compromise, and it was decided at length that she was to be buried in consecrated ground, but without the special attentions which should have gone to a woman who was a potential saint. Nevertheless, a large number of the poorer and more ignorant devout made up a disorderly cortege, which followed the coffin through the dust all the way from Breno to Monte Salvatore. There were in it old men and women, a great many dirty children who looked upon the excursion in the light of an outing, 3 men who were quite drunk and sang, and even a woman pushing a perambulator. Immediately behind the coffin marched Sister Annunziata, who had disobeyed her superiors and joined the cortege. She still had in her plain face the light of a happiness that did not come of this world. At her side walked Fulco Baldassare, clad in his checkered bookmaker's suit, and protecting himself from the brilliant sun with the black cotton umbrella. It was all very gay and dishevelled in the best Italian tradition. And when the excitement had died away, a little so that Mr. Winnery felt he might undertake his investigation discreetly and without becoming involved, he set out to visit Signora Bardelli. The janitress, he felt, would be able to give him a straightforward and realistic account of what had happened, unmarred and distorted by the trimmings with which more religious and emotional witnesses were certain to decorate the strange case of Miss Annie Spragg. But Signora Bardelli had disappeared from the Palazzo Gonfarini, and the new janitress, a gaunt, witch-like and very dirty woman who had been among those in the disorderly cortege, proved taciturn and ill-natured. It was only after Mr. Winnery had pressed into her hand a fraction of Aunt Bessie's fortune that she told him what had happened and where the former janitress could be found. Signora Bardelli, it appeared, had behaved scandalously. No sooner had the body of Miss Annie Spragg been removed from the Palazzo Gonfarini that the janitress began spreading a singular story. She expressed it as her belief that Miss Annie Spragg was not a holy woman at all, but that she had been in alliance with the dark powers of fertility during her entire lifetime. Her relics, said Signora Bardelli, were efficacious in the case of barren women. Although she conceded a belief that any of the relics possessed a certain power, she was convinced that its very centre was concentrated in the only piece of furniture left behind by the relic snatchers, the bed upon which Miss Annie Spragg had died. The act of spending a night in this bed had, she declared, a miraculous effect. She fixed a price of 40 lire for the privilege, and before Father Dastier, her employer, discovered the outrage, she had already accumulated 3 customers. And then Father Dastier had come to the palace in person and had thrown her into the street. But she had taken the miraculous bed with her, and she was now living in a tiny house in the village of Monte Salvatore, where she had set it up once more and was doing a good business. Fate, reflected Mr. Winnery, was always drawing him back to Monte Salvatore. But before going, he went to seek out the fat little Father Baldassare and the gaunt Sister Annunziata, to gather from them their version of the miracle. The priest had disappeared completely. None knew whither. His former acquaintances only confirmed the gossip of Maria that he had gone out to bring the world back to the simplicity of Jesus. He had, they believed, now gone completely mad. But since in Italy people paid small attention to crazy people, there was nothing to be done about it. At the convent, Sister Maria Maddalena told him that Sister Annunziata could see no one. She had been ill for a week and quite out of her head. In her illness she had gone about saying such astounding and scandalous things that they thought it better to keep her in seclusion until the poor thing had recovered her senses. Mr. Winnery, somewhat cast down, hired a fiacre and set out for Monte Salvatore. He felt that in all the confusion of the superstition and madness, it would be refreshing to talk with a woman of hard common sense like Signora Bardelli. End of section 74. Coda, Part 5. Section 75, Coda, Part 6, The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 75, Coda, Part 6. As Mr. Winnery made his entrance, Signora Bardelli was just receiving 40 lire from a pretty young peasant woman who had spent the night on the bed of Miss Annie Spragg. The woman was telling her story for the 3rd time. She had been married 7 years, and although she had prayed to all the saints of fertility, there had been no answer to her prayer. Her husband was growing impatient. He already had a child outside of wedlock, and he was fonder of this child than of his wife. The woman wept a little, and Signora Bardelli assured her, with all the authority and brightness of a successful surgeon, that from now on everything would be all right. It was a small room in one of the bilious yellow houses of Monte Salvatore, and it stood on the slope of the hill overlooking the lonely valley where the Villa Leonardo perched in its decaying and lonely splendour. In the evening the very shadow of the monastery fell across its doorstep. Unwilling to intrude upon the delicate transactions that were taking place, Mr. Winnery waited just outside the door. He heard the former janitress giving the young woman earnest advice. Then he heard her selling for 10 lire a mixture composed, she said, of amber, laurel, and a powder made from the hill viper. This the young woman was to put into her husband's wine every night for 7 nights, following the next change of the moon. And she sold a charm containing a vial of powder, composition undescribed during the transaction, which she was to wear suspended between her 2 breasts. If nothing happened within 3 months, Signora Bardelli advised returning to spend another night in the bed of Signora Spragg. Some cases, she pointed out, were more difficult than others. It all sounded, thought Mr. Winnery, rather like the last consultation he had had with the expensive Dr. Goss on the subject of his liver. Then the peasant woman departed, and Mr. Winnery brightly made his entrance. He planned to take Signora Bardelli directly into his confidence, and so let her understand that he knew she was a shrewd and clever swindler. His plan failed. The former janitress eyed him at once with suspicion, and even after he had explained his mission and the great work he had undertaken in driving superstition from the world, she warmed only a little, and that faint shade of warmth he divined only when he referred to the superstitions of the church. She was, however, willing to discuss the case of Miss Annie Spragg, and asked him to sit down, giving him to understand that the talk would be in the nature of a consultation, and would, of course, call for a fee. Mr. Winnery, dashed a bit by his reception, thought bitterly, "These free, generous Italians." It was a square plain room in which dried herbs hung from the ceiling, together with strings of garlic and red peppers. The walls, once painted white, were blackened by smoke. At one side there was a row of shelves with pots and jars of many sizes, colours, and descriptions, neatly arranged according to size, and in one corner there was a sort of throne, like that in a restaurant. It had a till for receiving money. The whole room was all arranged efficiently, rather in the manner, thought Mr. Winnery, of an office of a specialist who charged 5 guineas a consultation. Certainly it was an organised business, quite as organised as the church itself. The room was quite clean. Mr. Winnery seated himself on a wooden bench opposite the doorway, and Signora Bardelli, taking off her spectacles, seated herself opposite him. It was not until he sat down that he noticed the magnificence of the view. The doorway gave out upon the lonely valley, and far off, dimly seen through the haze of heat, he discerned the dark grove of trees which marked the Villa Leonardo. End of section 75. Coda, Part 6.
Section 76 of The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Louis Bromfield. The Janitress Tale. 1. She did not know how Miss Annie Spragg had come to take lodgings in the Palazzo Gonfarini. The old maid was already installed when Signora Bardelli took over the post of janitress on the death of the old man who had preceded her as caretaker. Miss Annie Spragg was already established, and a fixture she remained. She was not a troublesome tenant. She did not, like some of Signora Bardelli's lodgers, return home drunk, or beat her children, or stab indiscriminately the other lodgers. She seemed to have no wants, and in all the years she lived there she had never made a complaint. She was very clean and seemed content with a room which contained only a bed, a chair, and a washstand. She always paid her rent regularly until 3 weeks before her death, and then, of course, she could not pay it because her money had come to an end. Where this money had come from, Signora Bardelli did not know. Miss Annie Spragg had never in all the years she had lived in the Palazzo Gonfarini received a letter. She had no friends, and much of her time was spent in the churches, mainly at San Giovanni, before the celebrated paintings of St. John the Shepherd. She had learned to speak a little Italian, but she was never really able to converse in that tongue. In the 3rd year after the janitress came to the Palazzo Gonfarini, Miss Annie Spragg came one day and asked her if she knew where there was a place she could go in the mountains to pass a month now and then. It must be very cheap, she said, because she had no money, and she would like it to be in some rather remote region where she would not be troubled by tourists. Signora Bardelli thought at once of her sister-in-law, who lived in a village called Bestia, high in a remote part of the mountains. She sent word by a cousin, since neither the sister-in-law nor her husband could read, and received an answer that they would be glad of the money to be got by having a visitor. It was arranged to meet Miss Annie Spragg at Analo, which was the terminal of the railroad. Beyond Analo, there were only mountain roads and donkey carts. It was a wild country, said the janitress, which she had not seen since childhood. There were a few olive orchards and herds of goats, and halfway down the mountains they were able to grow vines in the crevices of the volcanic rock. There were wolves, which in winter became ferocious, and sometimes attacked people in remote villages and farms. At Bestia there was no church, and the inhabitants were forced to drive all the way to Analo to communicate with the priest. Therefore they seldom saw priests, except when someone died or was born. Sometimes children grew to manhood and womanhood and died without ever being received into the church. They had a kind of religion of their own, which was a mixture of Christianity and old legends, half lost in the mists of time. It was at Bestia that Signora Bardelli had learned the science of herbs and charms. The people there knew about such things, and one old woman, long since dead, had taught all she knew to the janitress. She had long sold herbs and charms to the poor, the janitress said, but it was only since she had acquired the bed of Miss Annie Spragg and lost her place as janitress that she had really set herself up in a legitimate way. The family of the sister-in-law consisted of the mother and father, a goat herd, and 11 children. There was a room over the stable which they gave to Miss Annie Spragg when she arrived bearing a straw suitcase and an empty bird cage. The entire family slept in one room. From the beginning, their strange lodger proved a help to them. She asked nothing, and she paid regularly. She did not talk much, and spent a great deal of time on the mountain, setting out in the morning with bread and cheese and a little wine, and returning at sunset. On her second visit, she offered timidly to watch Giuseppe's goats while they wandered along the mountainside. These were willful and troublesome goats, which wandered off into ravines and woods and caused Giuseppe much anxiety, but with Miss Annie Spragg their character appeared to undergo a change. They became docile and stayed near her while she was making watercolor sketches or knitting clothes for Giuseppe's half-clad family, or simply wandering about over the mountainside gathering wildflowers and listening to the birds. She was a great help to Giuseppe because her taking charge of the goats freed another son to help him in the rude orchards and vineyards. People began to notice that she had a strange power over animals and to regard her with respect. It was only the wife, Signora Bardelli's sister-in-law, who did not like her. She thought there was something strange about the lodger, and even spread the story that Miss Annie Spragg had the power of the evil eye. Among the children of the sister-in-law, there was one, a little girl of 9, who, her parents believed, was possessed of a devil. The old priest from Analo had tried to exorcise the demon, and when he had failed, they sought the aid of the old woman who was the herb doctor. She also tried and failed. The child's name was Peppina, and she gave them a great deal of trouble. She was a pretty child with thick black hair and great black eyes, and for days at a time she would be well behaved and docile. But she had seizures when she would run away and hide among the ravines in the mountainside. Sometimes they would not find her for days. Once she fell into a stream and was nearly drowned, and on another time she set fire to the house in which they lived. She fell down at times in a fit and had strange visions. Upon this child, Miss Annie Spragg had the same effect as upon the goats. With the old maid, Peppina remained docile and well behaved, but as soon as Miss Annie Spragg left Bestia, the child began once more to cause some trouble, and they had to beat her and try new ways of driving out the demon. When she was 11, she took to accompanying the old maid and the goats when they set out in the morning to feed on the mountainside. For 5 years, Miss Annie Spragg went each summer to occupy the room over the stable at Bestia, and each time when she returned to the Palazzo Gonfarini, she brought with her a cage filled with small birds, most of them being a kind of sparrow, which frequented the mountains, and because of its smallness was worth nothing as food to the peasants. When she left her room in the Palazzo Gonfarini in the spring, Miss Annie Spragg opened the window and allowed them to escape. Signora Bardelli believed they were always the same birds. They spent the winter at the Palazzo Gonfarini, and flew back in summer to rejoin Miss Annie Spragg at Bestia. Once she even brought back with her a box filled with field mice. In Bestia they no longer thought her queer. She became a part of the place. They even came to date things by the arrival and departure of the old maid, as if her coming marked the beginning of summer and her departure the arrival of the long Italian autumn. She might have continued going summer after summer to Bestia, said Signora Bardelli, but a strange thing happened. One night at midnight, her brother-in-law was awakened by the smell of smoke and discovered that the house was burning. At first he believed it was the demon in Peppina who had set the fire a second time, but when he had awakened all his family, he discovered that Peppina was not there at all. He discovered, too, that the lodger's room above the stable was empty, and that in the stable the goats had disappeared. When he had put out the fire, he set out to find the goats. In the darkness he went up the mountainside, calling out Peppina's name and uttering at intervals the half-human, half-animal cry which he used in calling the goats when they had strayed. But there was no answer. He had wandered for hours over the rocks and pastures when dawn at last began to slip in through the valleys and crevasses and down the wild rocky slopes, and he turned toward home. Cold blue mist veiled the hillside and clung to the groves of ancient olive trees planted among the outcroppings of gray tufa. The poor man, not knowing what to think, began to believe that Peppina's demon had swept Peppina and their lodger and his goats off into limbo. As his bewilderment increased, he became certain that he would never see any of them again. He regretted the loss of Peppina, said the ex-janitress, far less than he regretted the loss of the goats, for she was only a source of trouble to her parents, and goats were valuable property. He began to fret over what he would tell the police when it was discovered that Miss Annie Spragg, too, had been swallowed up. He told himself that this was what came of having to do with a strange foreign woman, and that his wife was right in suspecting her of being a witch. In the midst of his reflections, he heard suddenly the faint, far-off tinkle of the bell that the black he-goat wore about his neck, and halting, he stood listening until he made certain that he was not imagining the sound, and then to discover from what direction the sound came. Looking down, he saw far below him, half hidden in mists, so that it was visible one moment and not the next, a little procession which had a strange likeness to a procession of children on their way from a first communion. At the head walked sedately the black he-goat who wore the bell, and behind him came all the herd. In the rear, like the parents who followed the children, walked Miss Annie Spragg and Peppina. They seemed to be wearing wreaths on their heads, and Miss Annie Spragg was without the black veil she always wore. There was no way of descending directly to them, and the puzzled man was forced to go by the tortuous narrow paths that led down among the rocks and trees. When he reached the bottom of the crevasse, the procession had disappeared, but there remained in the red earth the neat little prints of goats' hooves. When he reached the farm once more, it was quite light, but he found that all his family were still asleep, and that beside the oven on her mattress of straw, Peppina was also sleeping soundly. In the stable the goats were in their pen, as they should have been, and when he entered they pushed forward behind their leader, the black he-goat, to be led out to feed. And in the room overhead Miss Annie Spragg was asleep. On the floor beside her there were a few bruised and withered laurel leaves. Thinking that he too must have been possessed of a demon who had driven him out on the mountain in the middle of the night for nothing, the poor man returned and roused his wife, telling her all that he had seen. Because he was confused and could not believe his senses, they examined the beams above the oven to make certain there had ever been a fire. There had been a fire. The beams were all charred. They went to awaken Peppina, but she could not be awakened. They struck her and called her evil names, but the girl only slept on quietly. The smaller children wakened and began to scream with fright, and in all the confusion the father lost his head and sat down and wept. But his wife did not take leave of her senses. She cried out that their lodger was a witch, and that she had known it all along, and now they would be free of her at last. She went to the stable and roused Miss Annie Spragg, who said nothing in reply to the woman's abuse, but packed her shabby bag in silence. Then the old maid set out along the road to Annunziata, carrying her bag, her cage of little birds, and her box of watercolors. The wife followed her for 3 miles along the road, hiding from time to time in the bushes and behind rocks, to watch and make certain that she did not return, and to see whether she might not vanish abruptly into thin air. When the figure of the old maid had disappeared at last on the serpentine road leading down the mountain to the high valley of Annunziata, the woman returned to the lonely farm, and taking beeswax and 3 red hairs and 7 nail parings from a little box, she molded the beeswax into the image of the thin old maid, and embedded the nail parings and the 3 hairs deep in the wax, and sticking a pin through the place where the heart should have been, she threw the whole thing into the oven. She had been waiting all the while. The red hair was Miss Annie Spragg's hair, and the parings were the parings of Miss Annie Spragg's nails. When the image had gone up in a burst of flame, Peppina stirred on her bed and wakened, but when they talked to her, she could remember nothing. She had, she said, been asleep in her bed all the night. She was 15 years old at the time, and developed like a woman of 30. But it was the end of Peppina, said Signora Bardelli. After that the demon claimed her for his own. She had many respectable suitors, some of whom were rich, but she would have none of them, and ran off in the end with a corporal of the Carabinieri, who had been sent into the mountains to run to earth a notorious brigand. He was a gigantic and ugly brute, more like an animal than a man. He beat her cruelly, and was stabbed to death at last by a man he found in Peppina's bed when he came home unexpectedly. After that Peppina disappeared. A young native of Annunziata, returning from South America, said he had seen her there in a brothel on the waterfront of Rio de Janeiro. She was dancing naked in the midst of a circle of sailors, white men and black men, yellow men and brown men. But no one knew for certain that the woman was Peppina. End of section 76. Read by Elsie Selwyn.
Section 77. The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 1. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 77. The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 1. Mr. Winnery, listening to the tale, grew more and more bewildered. This woman, whom he had expected to find sensible, he saw was no different from all the others. He saw that she believed all that she was telling him, and that he could never persuade her that it was all nonsense. She too was like all the others, the prey of superstition, the victim of ancient legends. It was simply another kind of superstition, different and more ancient and more deeply rooted than the superstitions which led Sister Annunziata to believe that she was chosen by St. Francis as the elect of God. Sister Annunziata was more than half crazy, and they were right perhaps in shutting her up, but this shrewd, hard peasant woman was clearly not mad. To Sister Annunziata, Miss Annie Spragg was a white saint, and to Signora Bardelli, the old maid, was a black saint. He said to her, "But the stigmata, how can a witch have received the miracle of the stigmata?" She looked at him mysteriously and replied, "That I do not know. It is all very strange." "I do not know," observed Signora Bardelli, "unless it is the work of the devil. Perhaps it is a joke played on the church by something that is older than the church, older even than Christianity. I have been told that things like that are the oldest things in the world. She was stubborn and would not be shaken from her beliefs into the admission that her sister-in-law and her husband might have imagined such a story, or that there had really been none of the marks of the stigmata on the body of Miss Annie Spragg. She had seen the scars with her own eyes. A figure suddenly filled the doorway, throwing a blue shadow across the earthen floor. It was a tall, heavy woman, a peasant with a light shawl thrown over her head to keep off the sun. She spoke to Signora Bardelli. She had walked down from the mountains 27 miles to sleep in the bed of Miss Annie Spragg. She had been married for 13 years and had never had a child. Mr. Winnery, with a sense of intruding a second time upon a delicate situation, rose and gave Signora Bardelli 10 lire for the consultation. Then he bade her good-bye, aware that she had disapproved of him as one who sought to meddle in things he could not understand. The tall, heavy peasant woman sat wearily down on the chair he had left, and he walked out again into the blazing square where the battered fiacre and the bony horses stood waiting for him in the shadow of an enormous fig tree. For a moment the light blinded him. He felt weary and hot, and then he saw the deep, cool valley of Monte Salvatore coming into form, and on its side the distant black patch of cypresses that marked the Villa Leonardo. A sense of the immense futility of everything swept over him, and he thought, "Why should I trouble myself about these things? Let them believe what they like. That peasant woman is happier in the hope that a night on the Spragg woman's bed will give her the power of bringing more brats into an overcrowded world. She is happier than if she had stayed in her village without any hope. Life is short, and I have wasted most of it. It is time that I began to bring my life to something." Suddenly he wasn't interested in miracles and other natural phenomena. He wanted to see Miss Fosdick. The heat, the smell of the fig tree, the sight of the former janitress doing her best to make the world a fertile place, made him feel languorous. He became the prey of his own imagination. He, a respectable man of 53 who had led a virginal existence, was becoming amorous. He wakened the sleeping driver and said, "Go to the Villa Leonardo," and pointing with the malacca stick he had purchased to celebrate the passing of Aunt Bessie and the beginning of his courtship, he added, "It is yonder, that patch of cypresses." He would face Mrs. Weatherby again and tell her the truth, that he proposed to marry her companion, and that nothing could stop him, not even the famous 20 years of devotion. End of section 77, The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 1. Section 78, The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 2. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 78. The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 2. As he drove up the long avenue between the rows of grotesque and ancient oaks, he was stirred again by the villa's sense of loneliness and utter isolation. The windows were again tightly shuttered, and this time there was no red and black motor standing before the door. The white flame of yucca set among the swords had turned brown and dead and withered away. He got down. It had become a habit with him, as if he were an old friend of the household, and went through the dark tunnel of greenery. The garden had an unkempt look, for the dry heat of early autumn had detached the yellow leaves of the plane trees, and left them dead and drifted in little piles along the colonnades of mottled trunks. The grave where the statue had been reburied had sunk now, so that there was a little hollow instead of a mound. Then he discovered that the back of the villa presented the same appearance as the front. It was closed. Every door and shutter was fastened. They had gone away, he saw, and Miss Fosdick was perhaps lost forever. With the malacca stick he pounded on the door. A kind of recklessness entered his soul. He called out the name of Miss Fosdick, but no one answered. He was about to leave when he saw emerging from the decaying stables the abundant figure of Margarita. The girl came toward him, and when she was near enough to speak, she said that Signora Wetterby had gone away, not only for this season, but forever. She did not know where she had gone, but she supposed she had gone back to her house in Breno. When he asked her why she had gone away, the girl said that she had taken a dislike to the place. The villa itself had been sold over Signora Wetterby's head. The truth, she added, was that she had been driven out. It was all the doing of the statue, she said. It ought never to have been buried again. It was taking vengeance on Signora Wetterby. No sooner was it buried than strange things began to happen. Signora Wetterby had been unable to sleep, and in the middle of the night she had heard music and sounds of wild gaieties in the garden. She, Margarita, had heard none of the sounds, nor any of the other servants, but Signora Wetterby insisted there were sounds, and accused them of disturbing her rest, although, said Margarita, they had all been sleeping soundly. It went on night after night, and then one morning Signora Wetterby packed all her belongings and got into the ford with her dogs and the parrot Anubis without even saying goodbye, and Giovanni drove her back to Breno. Signora Wetterby, she said, was a strange woman and imagined things. It was her belief that perhaps Signora Wetterby was a witch. She had seen her standing on her head on the terrace in the moonlight, clad only in a pair of man's trousers. Surely such goings-on could be indulged in only by a witch. What did the signor think? Mr. Winnery, who by now had begun to think that he was losing his reason, said that perhaps she was a witch, or perhaps she was only doing the exercises that were part of a certain religious cult. Who, he asked, had bought the villa? It was the Principessa Dorabelli. Margarita had heard that she had bought it suddenly without even asking the price, and that she meant to retire to it and spend the rest of her life there. She had not even come to see the place. She had heard that the Principessa planned to install bathrooms. That, thought Margarita, would be exciting. She had never seen a bathroom. Was it true that the Principessa was an American lady? And then quite suddenly Margarita said, Signora Wetterby went away 3 days ago, but Signora Fosdick returned this morning. Where? Cried Mr. Winnery. Where is she? Margarita said she did not know it was Signora Fosdick he wanted to see. She thought it was Signora Wetterby. She even, and here she became arch, thought that perhaps there was a romance with Signora Wetterby. Signora Fosdick had arrived on foot, carrying her bag. On foot? Exclaimed Mr. Winnery. In this heat? See, and she ran away on foot. Ran away? Repeated Mr. Winnery. She ran away. Signora Wetterby did not know she was going. A great light burst on Mr. Winnery. He wasted no more time talking with Margarita. Leaving her astonished in the midst of a long recital, he went to the villa, and this time, without knocking, he pushed open the door. There was a rustle of dried leaves in the hallway, and a rat scurried off into the shadows. He did not like rats. The sight of them made his hair rise up on end. But he pushed bravely on, calling out, Miss Fosdick, Miss Fosdick, again and again, but there was no answer. The names simply echoed through the empty house. Perhaps, he thought wildly, she has killed herself, and I shall find the body. He went from room to room. All were closed, and the only light filtered in dimly from the cracks in the shutters. The big salon overlooking the valley was empty, and the bare dining room and the small room under the stairway. He started up the stairs and was halfway to the top when he heard below him a slight scuffling sound among the dead leaves. Turning, he saw Miss Fosdick. She had come out of the salon and was trying to escape before he discovered her. "Miss Fosdick," he called out, "I've been searching for you." She halted and stood against the wall without looking at him. She had in her hand the worn handbag. The black dress was covered with dust to the knees, and her hat had slipped a little over one ear. She was flushed and trembling, and her brown hair was all in disarray. He came down the stairs toward her. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I've been twice before to call at the villa. Mrs. Weatherby told me you had gone off on a holiday." He tried to put her at ease by behaving as if there was nothing in the least strange in finding her thus. "I really wanted to see you again." She began suddenly to cry. "I don't want to see you. I don't want to see anyone. I only want to die. I'm useless and no good to anyone. I'm better out of the way. I ought to kill myself, but I can't even do that properly." He had arrived in time. She had been thinking of suicide. Without quite knowing what he was doing, he slipped an arm gently about her shoulders. She did not protest or draw away from him. "You're not useless, Miss Fosdick," he said gently. "None of God's creatures are useless. Come, let's sit down somewhere and talk. I've been looking for you for days." She seemed too tired either to protest or speak, and he led her gently into the big salon. He did not think of his own feelings, for in the excitement he had forgotten to be literary. Miss Fosdick seemed plumper and prettier than he had ever imagined, and in her distress far more charming. The furniture had been stacked into one corner. He selected one of the uncomfortable chairs and bade her sit in it. She obeyed him meekly as a rabbit. Then he opened the shutters, and in a blaze of golden light the whole length of the glorious valley opened up before them. Drawing up another uncomfortable chair, he seated himself and said, "Tell me now, perhaps I can help you." But she seemed unable to do anything but sob. "Margarita," he said, "told me you had run away. She told me the whole story." Then the floodgates burst, and the whole torrent poured forth. She told him the long story of her 20 years' devotion to Mrs. Weatherby, and how in the end, when she could stand it no longer, she had run away, and she had come back because her money had given out, and at the pension they would keep her no longer unless she paid in advance. She had tried to get work as a companion. She had even advertised in the papers, but there had only been 3 replies. One was from a clergyman's widow, who required that she know how to do crochet and do tatting. Another was from an elderly spinster who wanted to be read to in Italian, and the third was from a retired army officer with an invalid wife, who required a woman who was young and pretty and who had been trained as a nurse. "And I," said Miss Fosdick, "can do none of these things, so I came back. I came back to Aunt Henrietta, and now she has gone. I don't know what I'm to do. I haven't any money, and I don't know how to do anything but be a companion to Aunt Henrietta. I ought to die." Mr. Winnery, feeling very masculine and medieval, told her that they must first of all be practical. She must go back to Breno in the fiacre with him. He would lend her money until they worked out her problem. He told her about Aunt Bessie's death and how he was now a rich man. He had a feeling for her, he said, from the very beginning. He had known all along that she was unhappy with the seeress. But Miss Fosdick suddenly grew respectable and unfeminine. "No," she said, "I couldn't do that. I couldn't accept any money from a gentleman I barely know. A lady can't do such things." For a moment Mr. Winnery was irritated, and then he remembered that of course she was in trouble and he must be gentle with her. He tried to make her understand that it was purely a business matter and that she could pay him back. But beneath his arguments, Miss Fosdick only grew more and more respectable. He might have been a lecherous old man planning the ruin of a young virgin. He wanted to say, "Well, if you don't borrow money from me, what on earth are you going to do?" He would have said it if he had not thought her so charming, with her plump face flushed and her eyes damp with tears. And then he thought of a solution. "You can pay me back by going to work for me." "But how can I work for you? There is nothing I can do." Nevertheless, at this shadow of hope, she grew more quiet, and took a handkerchief from her handbag and began to dry her eyes. Mr. Winnery explained to her all about miracles and other natural phenomena, and the state of confusion in which the vast amount of notes, copyings, and references continually found themselves. It would be her task to keep them in order, tied into little bundles and ticketed. It was not a difficult task, he pointed out, nor one that required training. All it needed was a clear head. "But I haven't a clear head," echoed Miss Fosdick. "I always muddle everything." Well, well. In any case, we must make a try. It will be a help to me and will provide money for you." While he was speaking, Mr. Winnery made a remarkable discovery. It was this, that during the period Miss Fosdick had apparently been drying her tears, her flushed face had grown perceptibly paler. For a moment he thought with alarm that perhaps she meant to faint, and then suddenly he understood the phenomenon. Undoubtedly there was a powder puff concealed in the folds of the handkerchief. The discovery touched him. As a means of powdering the nose, it was a fashion so much more refined than that used by women like the Dorabelli, who simply extracted an apparatus from her bag and sent boldly the powder flying in all directions. Again he touched Miss Fosdick's hand. "There now," he said, "you're feeling better, aren't you? There's no need of ever going back to Mrs. Weatherby. Never again." Miss Fosdick admitted almost grudgingly that there did seem to be hope. "And now we can start back to Breno. I have a fiacre outside. I will pay you a week's wages in advance, and you can go back to the pension." Miss Fosdick thought perhaps she had better take less than that. She doubted whether she would last a week. But Mr. Winnery reassured her. "Mrs. Weatherby," he said, "always preaches self-confidence is the first of the virtues. Besides, I am certain that you are just the secretary I've been seeking. I'm sure," he added with meaning, "that you'll last for months and years." They went through the empty hall, where the dead leaves still rustled in the draught from the open door, and on the steps leading down into the garden, Mr. Winnery halted a moment to regard the view. "It is a beautiful place," he said. "It would be a splendid place to live. Only I hear the Princess Dorabelli has bought it for herself." End of section 78. The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 2. Section 79. The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 3. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 79. The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 3. They drove back to Breno, where Mr. Winnery escorted her to the pension, and the next morning at 10 she appeared for work. She lasted 1 week, and then 2, and then 3, tasting for the first time the sweets of a woman's economic independence. She muddled the mass of notes and papers hopelessly so that Mr. Winnery was unable to find anything he wanted, whereas before he had been able to find at least a few things. But it did not seem to annoy Mr. Winnery, and at the beginning of the 4th week he asked Miss Fosdick quite suddenly to marry him, and quite suddenly she accepted. It was agreed that they were to go to Iowa on their honeymoon because Mr. Winnery had a desire to see America, and Mrs. Winnery wanted to revisit Winnebago Falls. Not the least of her motives was a desire to exhibit her rich and distinguished husband. As a kind of second thought, Mr. Winnery said that it would give him an opportunity to go into the very beginnings of the strange case of Miss Annie Spragg. End of section 79. The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 3.
Section 80. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by April 6090. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Louis Bromfield. The Romance of Dr. Winnery, Part 4. A week before Mr. Winnery paid Signora Bardelli the only visit he ever made her, the Principessa gave in Venice the famous fête which each year marked the peak of the season. It attained a new measure of splendor and magnificence, and attracted the fashionable and the notorious from every part of Europe. Millionaires, decayed royalty, gigolos, actresses, demi-mondaines, even 2 ministers of state enjoying pompous holidays were present. It went off in a blaze of triumph with Bengal lights, and 3 orchestras and a whole fleet of decorated gondolas. Anna d'Orbelli and Oreste, Duke of Fonterrabia, appeared in the costumes of the Countess Gigacioli and Lord Byron, and Father d'Estier was seen, moving about wearily, and looking old and tired in the robes of Mazarin, which suited him to perfection. It was the first ball in years which Mr. Winnery had not described at second hand in his correspondence to the Lady's Own World. And 2 days later, when the curtains of Anna d'Orbelli's bedchamber were pulled back to let the morning sun stream in, there was a letter on the lacquered tray beside her chocolate. It was the letter in the handwriting of the Duke de Fonterrabia, which she had been awaiting for nearly 2 years. It was quite short and rather cold. It simply said that he had been forced to undertake a voyage to the Argentine, and that he regretted not having had a chance to bid his beloved Anna farewell. He would write her and see her on his return. But she knew well enough that it was the end. Voyez, c'est la vieille princesse. For 2 days she was not seen, and on the 3rd day she left Venice mysteriously, and appeared with equal mystery in Brno, where she quickly set about restoring and preparing the Villa Leonardo. Because it was lonely, and because it was a state of ruin, it had been waiting for years a purchaser who saw its virtues. With a kind of mad vitality she attacked the refitting of the villa. Masons came and plumbers and painters. To Margarita and the other servants who lived on the place it all seemed a strange proceeding for one who was simply preparing a spot where she might retire from the world. 4 bathrooms were installed, and much furniture, not furniture like that Mrs. Weatherby had strewn about during her tenancy, but expensive and beautiful pieces that should have been in museums. The old chapel was opened again and put in order for religious ceremonies. There was such a confusion as the old villa had not seen since the great days of the Spanish ambassador. And at last, when the Principessa came herself, dressed handsomely all in black by Worth, to examine the progress of the work, she asked what had become of the statue they found in the garden. and Margarita told her that it had been buried again. The Principessa herself superintended the reopening of the grave, but they dug and dug without ever finding a trace of the statue, and at last Margarita confessed that she knew all along it was not there. It had already been dug up a second time and carted down the hillside, where it was set up in the barren, rocky little garden of Pietro, the goat-herd. The Principessa flew into a wild rage and said that the statue was her own, and that she meant to have it. She herself went to Pietro's hut to recover it. And when the palace was finished, Anna de Orbelli drove one day into Brigneux and sought out Father de Stier to show him the place she had prepared for her retirement. It was a warm day in April, when the hillside beyond Monte Salvatore was blue with violets and wild hyacinths, and the whole valley, that was by nature so bleak and barren, had turned fresh and green from the thin stream at the bottom to the wild woods on its crest. But in her black and red motor, the princess drove so fast that it was impossible to appreciate the beauties of the burgeoning countryside. They entered the villa by the main door and went from room to room, from the great salon with the anatomical paintings to the tiny room in the top fitted as a cell, with a hard iron bed, a crucifix, and a wooden bench, where Anna de Orbelli planned to retire for days at a time in prayer. They had very few words to say to each other. Father de Stier, from time to time, murmured banal compliments upon her taste, and the princess showed the rooms with indifference, as if it were a duty, as if she were saying all the while, "It is because of you that I have come to this. It is because of you that I must end my life in barren loneliness here in this solitary villa." When he asked her why she had troubled to put in so many bathrooms, she replied that she thought God would not mind if sometimes she had friends come to stop with her, and Father de Stier murmured that he supposed God would not mind, though that was scarcely the Church's idea of a religious retirement. When they finished the house, they went down into the garden. The colonnades of plane trees, which were no longer yellow and brown, as they had been 9 months earlier, when they last walked together in the garden. The whole place was covered by a canopy of fresh green leaves that in the spring sunlight appeared luminous, giving off a pure green light. The roses that climbed over the ancient stone balustrade above the valley were covered with white and yellow blossoms. Once Anna de Orbelli said, "This is a haunted garden." Margarita says at night they sometimes hear sounds of singing and dancing, although the place is quite empty. It was the ghost that drove away that preposterous Mrs. Weatherby. I don't mind that. I've never been afraid of ghosts. They found themselves suddenly at the end of one of the colonnades before a niche let recently into the mouldering wall. It was a niche such as one finds in the gardens of Italy, sheltering images of the Virgin, only the image was not that of the interceding Mary, but of a figure more ancient. It was the statue that had been dug up out of the cesspool. On the slab of stone beneath it there was an inscription. Father de Stier had need to read only the first line to know what it was. Dans les damnations les vieux, et la moindre chose, le supplice propre aux dames, et la progrès infini dans les vices et dans les crimes. L'âme s'intéressante se dépravant toujours, s'enfonçant nécessairement dans le mal diminué en progression géométrique pendant l'éternité. Michelet. He turned away in silence, and in silence they walked back to the villa, and entering the motor, drove back again at a mad speed, down the long hill through Mont Salvatore into Brigneux. They had talked a little, but they had said nothing with words. It was silence which spoke for them. End of section 80.
Section 81, The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 5, The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. A Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 81, The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 5. Father Dastier never saw her again, and after that people said that he had suddenly grown old. The woman whom he had once entertained by his wit, and helped with his worldly advice and solaced by his spiritual comfort, no longer found him either interesting or good company. He ceased to be amused by their vanities, and even while they were talking to him, his gaze would have a strange way of wandering off, as if in search of something or someone whom he would never find. At times he would pull himself up with a great effort, and try again to be what he had once been, but in the end he was too weary. People who had once included him in dinners and weekends began to neglect him. He went about bravely as usual in search of converts, following the season from London to Venice, to Paris, to Vienna, but clearly there was no longer any heart in his journeys. And so he came one night in July to be staying with the head of a great English Roman Catholic family. There had been people for dinner, and after dinner, feeling a hunger to be alone, he withdrew into the great library where the old Duke kept his famous collection. There he left the other men and hid himself behind a great globe, mounted in silver and mahogany, to turn quietly, half dreaming, the pages of an 18th century translation of Horace. And presently, when he had wearied of reading, he allowed the book to slip into his lap and sat with his eyes closed. It was through the mists of sleep that he became aware of the voices. Two men had seated themselves on the opposite side of the globe and were talking. One of them was English, and the other spoke with an Italian accent. The Italian, he knew, was the cousin of Faustino Dorabelli. He was a middle-aged man and rich with the profits of an automobile factory. The Englishman, he thought, must be Admiral Burnham, whom he had not seen in more than 20 years until tonight. Not, he thought, since he had gone to Malta on Nina's yacht, on the voyage that ended in meeting Anna. The two men were gossiping. He heard the Italian say, "After all, my cousin Faustino was never much of a husband for a woman like that. And she has kept remarkably young. She is quite extraordinary." And then the Englishman answered, "I knew her when she was first married. I met her in Malta. Do you remember her?" The voice of the Italian. "That was a long time ago. Even her second son, the one who is quite all right, is a grown man, but I hear she has come to the same end as most of them." There was a sound of the Admiral stirring in his chair, as if he were sitting up with interest. "She's found someone to console her," continued the Italian voice. "A young Italian. He calls himself a duke, but there are so many dukes. He makes ends meet by gambling." There was a slight pause, and then, "By doing what he can, but he won't need to worry for some time. She's very rich. It was her money that saved Faustino's family. She's an odd woman. She has no sense of the value of money. It's lucky she's always had so much. She met the gigolo at Nina de Porlac's." The voice of the Admiral sounded suddenly gruff and ill-tempered. "I could never see why Nina has such people about. She has a list of them for dances and weekends. When a woman gets to be Nina's age, young men don't flock about for love." There was a pause, and Father Dastier was aware that he must be very still, lest they discover that he was sitting there, for he knew that two men will gossip and say things of a woman that they would not say if a third were present. Honour to which he himself had sacrificed so much was, he thought, an artificial thing, like the clothes one put on before appearing in public. He found himself praying that they would not speak of her again, and then the voice of Faustino's cousin. "They say that Oreste Fontarabia went away on her account." Yes, she was always reluctant to give up love. A sigh, but a magnificent woman. We must remember what she was. I am glad to have news of her. I haven't seen her in years. And then the cracked voice of the childish old Duke moving toward them. I think, gentlemen, that we will join the ladies. When they had gone, Father Dastier replaced the volume of Horace, came out from his hiding place, and fixing his mouth into a worldly smile, went through the big door into the drawing-room, where the daughter of Admiral Burnham, who was a half-sister of Victor Dorabelli, was playing Chopin quietly in the far corner. He noticed that she had the same fine red hair and clear skin that Victor had. She was young and very beautiful, and in his weariness and confusion it seemed to him for a moment that she might have been his own daughter if he had chosen differently. He had only Fulco. That night, when he was alone again in his room over the Georgian doorway that faced the park, he closed and locked his door, and then sat down before the fire they had made for him, because he sometimes had chills at night, even in July. All through the interminable evening he had been thinking in the back of his mind, behind all the talk and chatter and the music made by the Burnham girl, of Fulco, and he made the astounding discovery that Fulco hadn't any longer the power of irritating him. He had begun to think of Fulco as poor Fulco, in the way he thought of Anna as poor Anna. That meant, he knew, that he was really an old man, and at the end of things. He saw that he alone was responsible for Fulco's very existence, and that he had, in a way, always shirked that responsibility. He saw poor Fulco in his checked suit and umbrella, wandering from village to village in Italy, trying to purify Christianity, and trying to free it of all the centuries of tiresome accumulations and growths. Fulco, who hadn't the power or the dignity or the presence to convince anyone of anything. Fulco attempting a new reformation. He turned away from the fire and began to undress. His hands trembled a little like those of a very old man. They had never trembled before. He was tired, but not too tired to make a resolution. He would go back to Italy tomorrow and go from town to town, searching out Fulco, and when he had found Fulco, he would reason with him to return to the church. He would even use his influence to help him, and he would tell Fulco that he was his son and the only relative who remained in the world. Together they would perhaps work something out, and when that was done he would retire into the monastery at Monte Salvatore and never come out again, not even in death. They could bury him in the end in the warm sunny garden above the valley. The old conflict in his ravaged soul seemed dead at last. The church was his mother, to whom he might return now that he had finished with life. The world had nothing better to offer, and he was tired of this world. End of section 81, The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 5. Section 82, The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 6, The Strange Case of Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 82, The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 6. He left suddenly, saying that he had been called back to Breno on business of the church. It was in Bologna, while his train was awaiting the train from Venice, that he bought the newspaper and read the small paragraph at the bottom of the page. In Milan, said the paper, A man later identified as a renegade priest named Baldassari had been found on a street corner preaching communism, and 12 vigilant and heroic young men in black shirts had pulled him down from the steps where he was speaking and beaten him and dosed him with castor oil. The offender had died the same night of his injuries. It is by such vigilance and heroic conduct, read the last florid sentence of the brief account, that our leader and our sacred Italy are preserved daily from the corruptions of those who would destroy both. It is hoped that the watchful young men will be properly rewarded for their service. Father Dastier closed his eyes and leaned back in the heat of the compartment. Communism, he thought. Poor Fulco had probably never heard of communism. They had killed him for preaching what Christ taught. In another day they would have made him a martyr and a saint. That night when he arrived at Brino, he went to the 2 bare small rooms, and taking a few books from them, he locked the door and, hiring a fiacre, drove up the long hill to Monte Salvatore. They were awaiting him, for he had sent a telegram ahead from Bologna. Inside the monastery they told him that the Principessa Dorabelli had not returned to the Villa Leonardo. She had leased it, they said, to some English people named Winnery, who were recently married. For a moment Father Dastier wondered whether it could be the pompous and common little man he had met on the day they found the statue in the garden, and then he told himself that a man like Mr. Winnery would scarcely be enjoying a honeymoon at his age. From the window of his room high up in the monastery above the house of Signora Bardelli, Father Dastier could see the distant lights of the villa twinkling like stars in the darkness. He knew what he had known all along, that she would never return there. End of section 82, The Romance of Mr. Winnery, Part 6. Section 83, Mr. Winnery's Private Miracle, Part 1. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 83. Mr. Winnery's Private Miracle, Part 1. So it was Mr. and Mrs. Winnery, née Fosdick, who were destined in the end to use the 4 bathtubs installed by the Princess Dorabelli for her retirement from the world. The very face of the villa had been changed, and the bleak, barren, and mournful air which once had invested it was gone forever. Like the countenances of ladies who have had their faces lifted, it appeared new and pleasant without losing altogether its engaging air of antiquity and experience. The garden was all in order now, and where only sour and brilliant green moss had once grown, there were now banks of flowers which actually grew with all the extravagance described in the tourist circulars on the subject of Brino. And Mr. Winnery, now that he was no longer forced to live in Brino, found it a lovely place. In the long summer twilights, he and the pregnant Mrs. Winnery walked slowly up and down the long colonnades of mottled plane trees, talking together in sudden bird-like bursts of intimacy of the days before they were brought together by the death and the miracle of Miss Annie Spragg. Neither of them had ever known any intimacy before, and its discovery enchanted them. She also told him a great deal more about Aunt Henrietta, each day thinking up fresh horrors to relate. She expressed surprise at the fact that Aunt Henrietta had never found him guilty of improper or suggestive advances. It was a kind of madness with her, Aunt Henrietta always believed that men were making improper remarks in her presence, or staring at her, or attempting flirtations. It was true, said Gertrude Winnery, that the seeress had been pinched once in the Museum of Pompeii by a guide who had seen her only from the rear. There had been a tremendous and most embarrassing scene, until her honour was vindicated by the arrest of the terrified little man who discovered abruptly that he had pinched a tornado. Yes, thought Mrs. Winnery, she was a little mad on the subject of her attractions. On their return, Mr. Winnery took for his study the room which the seeress had called her boudoir, and there he installed 4 large crates of confused notes, copyings, and false starts, which represented miracles and other natural phenomena. In this room he spent morning after morning struggling to bring order out of chaos, while Mrs. Winnery occupied herself with the delights of keeping house for herself instead of someone else. But his heart seemed to fail him, and the combative interest which had once animated the colossal work appeared to have suffered a decline. At length, in despair, as if he had been a writer of detective mysteries who must somehow bring the story to a close, he made a summary of the facts and information for and against the miraculous element in the case of Miss Annie Spragg. It included all the information he had been able to collect, both in Breno and Winnebago Falls. It seemed the only way to end the whole muddle. He began by setting down the elements which appeared to him to be subject to a reasonable explanation. He wrote, 1. The Church appears to have been entirely right in quietly discrediting the so-called miracle. The scars on the body of Miss Annie Spragg appear neither to have been of miraculous origin, nor to have appeared at the moment of her death, but clearly were the scars of wounds inflicted upon her at some time before the brutal murder of her brother at Winnebago Falls. It is on record that they were seen at the time of her examination in connection with the murder. The agency which inflicted the wounds will probably never be known, although it seems likely that they were inflicted by her brother, Reverend Uriah Spragg, a religious fanatic, as a punishment for some sin she had committed, and in the hope of redeeming her soul. See Old Puritan law for the branding of women caught in adultery. 2. The Church also appears to have been right in its quiet assumption that the visitation of St. Francis to Sister Annunziata was not of miraculous character, but only an hallucination due to her period of life and to definite physical causes, together with the discovery of what to her poor weak mind appeared to be evidence of the miraculous and authentic stigmata. 3. On the surface there appears to be nothing which might indicate that Miss Annie Spragg was anything but an eccentric old maid of the kind found frequently enough in small towns and religious communities. It must be remembered that she was the daughter of Cyrus Spragg, the prophet, and the sister of Uriah Spragg. The one was an oversexed and lecherous old man, and the other a religious fanatic. 4. The story of Bestia and the strange happenings there with Peppina and the goats may be explained, if they ever occurred at all, simply as the eccentricities of a half-mad old woman, magnified and embellished by the imaginations of superstitious and ignorant peasants, and of a woman, Signora Bardelli, the janitress, who was either sincerely or insincerely a devotee of the black arts. That Miss Annie Spragg was in any way responsible for the subsequent behaviour of the girl Peppina seems unlikely. The character of the girl from childhood was clearly that of an epileptic and a moral imbecile, and of one destined from birth to end her career in a brothel. 5. The testimony of the nun, Sister Annunziata, and the priest, Father Baldassari, later killed in a riot in Milan, where he was mistaken by fascists for a communist, is highly unreliable, owing to the unbalanced character of the nun's mind and the general stupidity of the priest, who appears to have been the dupe of various people throughout his life. 6. The brutal murder of Reverend Uriah Spragg could have been committed by a passing tramp, or by one of his own flock in a fit of hatred or religious insanity. 7. The apparently miraculous disappearance of Cyrus Spragg, the prophet, from the Temple of New Jerusalem lends itself to a much simpler solution than that put forth by his son, Obadiah, that he was carried to heaven in a chariot of fire. It seems more likely that he was killed by the hot-blooded suitor of the pretty Maria Weatherby, and that his body was buried secretly the same night by his 2 elder sons, who then endeavoured to carry out an imposture for the continued profit of themselves and their brothers and sisters. In this they failed through a lack of the prophet's vigour. There is no evidence of an effort made to find and bring to justice the Kentuckian Alonzo. Such a procedure would possibly have been embarrassing to the impostors by establishing the fact that the prophet really was dead. 8. The behaviour of Seamus Bosanquet and the visions he had may be explained as due to epilepsy, of which he was clearly a victim. There is nothing unusual in his visions of heaven, God, St. John the Shepherd and the angels, for he had heard of all these things from the priests and from old Mary Bosanquet, who was of a strongly superstitious and religious temperament. 9. There is nothing unusual in Miss Annie Spragg's choice of Italy as a place of retreat after the death of her brother. Italy is filled with eccentric old ladies whose youth was starved for all the romantic and operatic background which Italy supplies with such extravagance. Conclusion. All of these elements seem to fall within the category of the natural, and appear strange only as they are subject to the imaginations, the prejudices, and the superstitions of the various witnesses involved. On the other hand, wrote Mr. Winnery, there are certain elements which do not lend themselves to any reasonable solution. Among these are 1. The statement of the undertaker of Winnebago Falls that the wounds on the body of Reverend Uriah Spragg were like those which might have been made by some pronged instrument, such as the sharp horns of a goat. The skull had been pierced in 3 places by some sharp instrument, but it must be remembered that the black he-goat of Miss Annie Spragg was already dead at the time of the murder, having been killed that very morning by Uriah Spragg himself with a hatchet. Together with this element, there is also the fact that although the murder was committed on the open prairie, in broad daylight with no shelter of any kind nearer than 3 miles, and that although the body was still warm when found by Maria Hazlitt, no one was seen, and no trace of anyone was ever discovered near the spot, nor was any weapon ever found. 2. The story told by Seamus Bosanquet to Ed Hasselman and Maria Hazlitt of the orgies which took place in the March of Meeker's Gulch. Seamus Bosanquet had heard of God and the angels and the saints from the priests and from his mother, but it seems impossible that he had ever heard of pagan gods, either from the priests or from a mother who could neither read nor write. Therefore he could scarcely have imagined such a story, save by some obscure and scarcely believable trick of atavism. Nor does it seem possible that the story was invented by the woman Maria Hazlitt, who, brought up in a poorhouse and scarcely able to read or write, had certainly never heard of Dionysus or Bacchus. The Hazlitt woman, now nearly 70 years old, appears to be a simple countrywoman with an extraordinary attachment for the soil and for the drunken old man to whom she devoted her entire life. 3. The incident of Miss Annie Spragg's return at dawn from Meeker's Gulch, accompanied by the black he-goat. This could be said to have been only the hallucination of the drunken milkman, but for the discovery in the bedroom of Miss Annie Spragg of the chains and the crude handcuffs with which her brother chained her up at night. 4. The fact that from among all the saints Seamus Besanchy chose instinctively as his patron St. John the Shepherd. 5. The most singular and astonishing fact of all, that Seamus Besanchy ran out into the storm to meet his death at the very moment when Miss Annie Spragg lay dying in the Palazzo Gonferini on the other side of the world. Her own death occurred in the early morning of the 15th of August. At midnight of the 14th, Seamus Besanchy vanished into the storm from the shanty by the railroad in Winnebago Falls. It appears that he went directly to Meeker's Gulch as to a rendezvous, for it was here that he was found later by the Hazlitt woman, who alone seems to have known where to look for him. Allowing for the difference in time between Breno and Winnebago Falls, the deaths must have occurred at almost the same moment. Note, this fact leads one to believe that if the elements of time and space were always taken into consideration in such cases, there might emerge a whole and very strange new world filled with undiscovered relationships. Note, many other minor and contributory incidents have, by the passage of time, been lost in an obscurity from which it is scarcely possible to resurrect them for proper scientific examination. Among these may be noted the origins of the prophet Cyrus Spragg and the strange disappearance of Michael Besanchy in the so-called bottomless pond at Lakeville, Iowa. End of section 83, Mr. Winnery's Private Miracle, Part 1. Section 84, Mr. Winnery's Private Miracle, Part 2, The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 84, Mr. Winnery's Private Miracle, Part 2. One other curious fact came to light some time after Mr. Winnery had established himself at the Villa Leonardo. He had been walking one morning in the garden after breakfast, turning over and over in his mind the puzzling evidence he had just set down on paper, when he found himself suddenly before the statue, reading with some dim portion of his mind the inscription which began, Dans la damnation le feu est la moindre chose, etc., etc. All at once he was aware that the face of the statue possessed a similarity to the face of someone he had known in life, and for a long time he stood there studying the sensual and vigorous countenance, attempting to relate it to some face which hovered elusively as a ghost in the back of his consciousness. And then, all at once, he turned sharply about and hastened back to his study, where he took down from a box a faded daguerreotype. Armed with this, he descended again to the garden and stood for a long time comparing the face in the daguerreotype with that of Priapus, the god of fertility. When he returned at last to the villa, he took up his notebook and made in it the last entry he was ever to make in the strange case of Miss Annie Spragg. The strangest of all the facts, he wrote, is the likeness between the face of the statue found in the garden of the Villa Leonardo and the face in the daguerreotype portrait made of Cyrus Spragg on the day the prophet retired into the temple at New Jerusalem, never to be seen again by any man. The daguerreotype, secured by the author after much difficulty from the daughter of one of the original Spraggites, and therefore possibly a daughter of the prophet himself, has faded with age, but not sufficiently to weaken the certainty that the face of Cyrus Spragg, the prophet, and the face of the image of Priapus are the same face. And then, half credulously, he added, perhaps the story told by the prophet's son, Obadiah Spragg, was true. Perhaps Cyrus Spragg simply disappeared. End of section 84. Mr. Winnery's Private Miracle, Part 2. Section 85. Mr. Winnery's Private Miracle, Part 3. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield. Section 85. Mr. Winnery's Private Miracle, Part 3. He told Mrs. Winnery that the whole affair appeared hopelessly muddled and inexplicable, and that the solution was scarcely worth any further expenditure of his valuable time. Secretly he had a sense of it pointing towards something, but what this was he could not say. He did not tell Mrs. Winnery that in attempting to solve one mystery he had simply confronted another and more terrifying one, which neither scientists nor prophets nor saints had ever solved in all the centuries of the world's recorded existence. It made Mr. Winnery seem to himself small and insignificant and impertinent, and being a vain man, he did not care to have his wife share this discovery. Out of all the muddle, only one thing seemed to emerge clearly, that there was in the affair the evidence of some colossal struggle between all that was Christian and all that which Signora Bardelli described as older than the Church, older than Christianity itself, and that humanity was the battleground upon which the two ancient elements waged their colossal and endless conflict. The Church of Rome, he thought, although he did not confide this even to Mrs. Winnery, was right, just as it had been right in the question of Miss Annie Spragg's spurious miracle. It appeared to attempt a compromise. He had discovered that a primitive Methodist had been buried in consecrated ground by mistake, but only he knew this for a certainty, and he saw no reason to disturb the eternal rest of a poor eccentric old maid. Besides, such a thing did not seem to him to be a matter of any great importance. He bowed before the mystery, and, feeling somewhat ashamed of himself for his impertinence, packed away in crates in the cellar of the Villa Leonardo the vast accumulation of notes, copyings, and false starts, which represented miracles and other natural phenomena. This cellar was found, as he had supposed, to be of Etruscan construction. But the next day he began with singular energy a new work. This time it was not a scientific undertaking, but a historical romance, teeming with local colour. It was called Riccardo and Giuliana, and the setting was Brno in the time of the Renaissance. The hero, Riccardo, was a man 53 years old, who had spent his life in the service of the Dukes of Brno. The heroine, Giuliana, was a young girl of 35, who had been kept a prisoner since childhood in a lonely villa in the valley behind Monte Salvatore by an aunt who concealed a taste for sadism beneath a reputation for great piety. Among the subsidiary characters were Michelangelo, Leonardo, Machiavelli, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, Lorenzo the Magnificent, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, Botticelli, Fra Lippo Lippi, who supplied the comic relief, and a few others. In the end, Riccardo rescued Juliana, and they were married amid celebrations in which the joyous and carefree natives of Brino and all the foreigners living there took part. He told Mrs. Winnery that he thought he had found at last the proper medium for the expression of his literary talents. During the last month or two of her pregnancy, he read aloud to her chapter after chapter as they were completed. She was confined 6 weeks earlier than they had expected. It was the month of October when the goatherd Pietro kept a perpetual heap of offerings before the statue in the garden, and it was Sister Annunziata who brought him, pacing up and down in the ancient garden before the statue, the news that he was the father of twin boys. They no longer kept Sister Annunziata shut up because her madness seemed of a harmless nature, and madness was a thing never taken seriously in Italy. She simply believed that Miss Annie Spragg was an unappreciated saint, and that St. Francis was her guardian and companion day and night. In a vague gesture of gratitude toward the pagan gods of fertility, Mr. Winnery made a rich gift of money to Sister Annunziata's convent. It was used to restore abominably a series of famous frescoes by Gozzoli, which had faded almost into oblivion. So in the end, Aunt Bessie's money came to embellish a nonconformist chapel in Bloomsbury and a Roman Catholic convent in Brino. Mr. Winnery has completed his romance, for which he was granted the very rare honour of an interview with the dictator, and he has been made a Knight of the Order of St. Trevisius and a member of 3 societies of historical research having to do with Brino. Mrs. Winnery is about to have a 3rd child, and they are very happy in the Villa Leonardo, and are likely to remain its tenants for years to come, for the retirement of the Principessa Dorabelli grows each year more and more remote in its possibilities. The statue in the garden has never troubled them as it troubled others, because they are by nature a pair of innocents. Often as they drive happily into Brino with the nurse and the twins on the seat opposite them, they pass the house of Signora Bardelli, lying close against the wall of the monastery, where Father Dastier sought refuge. The retired janitress does a splendid business with the bed of Miss Annie Spragg, and has grown quite rich. There has even been talk of offering her a medal for her efforts on behalf of the apparently new but really ancient movement toward greater fertility of Italy. Mr. and Mrs. Winnery bowed to greet her pleasantly, for Mr. Winnery came in the end to the conviction that any belief which brought comfort to the human race had its own place in the divine scheme of things. Frequently the Winnerys drive to the Campo Santo of Monte Salvatore to carry flowers from the garden of the Villa Leonardo to the grave of Miss Annie Spragg. They have never forgotten that their meeting was due to her, and they are grateful to her for so much happiness. They always find there other flowers and sometimes branches of green olives, and even melons and fruit, for there remains scores and even hundreds among the poor and humble and superstitious who continue stubbornly to regard her as a saint. Florence, October 1926, Socoa, BP, France, July 1928. End of The Strange Case of Miss Annie Spragg by Bromfield.